Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The baker who robbed his own shop every Thursday. You wouldn't expect to find crime hiding beneath the scent of fresh croissants. But in the town of Langley-on-Wye, a sleepy village in Worcestershire with less than 3,000 residents, Thursday mornings came with more than their fair share of pastries. They came with suspicion. At the center of it all was Henry Dobbins, a third-generation baker. His family shop, Dobbins and Sons, had been a village staple for over 70 years. Locals swore by his honey oat rolls and his perfectly crisped almond danishes. He opened promptly at 4:00 a.m. and closed at noon, Monday through Saturday, with Thursdays being his busiest day. But every Thursday, like clockwork, something went missing. It started small, a few pounds short from the till, an extra bag of flour unaccounted for. Henry would mention it casually to customers, joking that the ghost of Grandad Dobbins must be baking on the side. The townspeople laughed. The constables dismissed it. After all, what kind of criminal would strike only on Thursdays and only at one small bakery? But the pattern held. Week after week, every Thursday morning something disappeared, and always before sunrise. The first serious attention came after a Thursday in mid-November when nearly £600 in cash, tucked in a locked drawer under the register, vanished without signs of forced entry. Henry called the police, not joking this time. Constable Marissa Kenley, a local officer nearing retirement, took the case. She knew Henry well. He had baked her retirement party cake early at her request, but her sense of duty overrode familiarity. She reviewed security footage, which was surprisingly sophisticated for such a humble shop. But oddly, the DVR had been unplugged, not entirely removed, just switched off at the back. The power button was pressed off. There was no forced entry into the store. "It's as if someone had the keys," she noted in her report. Henry denied giving anyone spare keys. Only he and his apprentice, Colin Marlowe, had access. Colin, a nervous young man fresh out of culinary college, insisted he never opened the shop alone. Yet every Thursday morning he arrived to find Henry already there. "He's always baking when I arrive," Colin said, "already covered in flour." Kenley started paying more attention. She asked Henry to call her personally if anything else seemed off. Henry agreed, almost too eagerly. Then came a strange detail. The bank reported that Henry was making large cash deposits each Thursday afternoon, far more than the bakery could reasonably earn from breakfast buns. This wasn't just a missing fiver. It was nearly £1,200, sometimes more. Kenley asked about the deposits. Henry's answer was straightforward. "Pre-orders," he said. "Local weddings, birthday parties. I just like to get paid in cash." He smiled in that charming, flour-dusted way that made Langley-on-Wye trust him with their wedding cakes and communion loaves. But records didn't show any recent large events in the village. No weddings. No birthday parties of scale. Nothing requiring £1,200 worth of pastry. When Kenley pressed again, Henry grew annoyed. "I've worked this shop for 30 years. You think I'm laundering money through cinnamon rolls?" She didn't, not yet. But the behavior didn't stop. Each Thursday, like clockwork, something was missing, yet Henry's cash reserves grew. One week, it was a crate of imported Belgian chocolate. Another, a full order of custom cake toppers. He always filed insurance claims, each one just low enough to avoid suspicion until taken together. Kenley decided to intervene directly. She asked for permission to install covert surveillance. Henry hesitated, then agreed. The new camera was hidden a pinhole lens inside the casing of a wall clock. It fed to an encrypted police server, not the bakery's faulty DVR. Thursday came again. At 3:45 a.m., the footage recorded Henry arriving alone. He unlocked the shop with his key, turned off the main lights, and pulled the DVR plug. He went about prepping dough, taking trays from the freezer. Nothing suspicious at first. Then at 4:22 a.m., he reached beneath the counter and removed an envelope. He opened the register, slipped out the till drawer, and replaced it with another from a bag he'd carried in a duplicate till, fully stocked with petty cash, designed to match the day's expected takings. He tucked the real drawer under his coat. There was no robbery. There hadn't been for weeks. Henry was robbing himself, creating fake losses, replacing evidence, and filing claims. The motive, more than just insurance fraud. Digging into his financials revealed a failing side business, a French pastry workshop in nearby Hereford, quietly bleeding money. He needed a way to cover expenses without selling the family shop or asking for help. But there was one more detail that troubled Kenley. Why Thursdays? The pattern didn't fit normal fraud behavior. If he'd done it once or twice, perhaps, but every Thursday. She reviewed the workshop records. Henry taught classes on Fridays. He needed cash by Thursday afternoon to pay instructors, suppliers, and venue fees. But how did no one catch this? Because no one expected the crime to be so boring, so repetitive, so small in scale each time that no one saw the pattern until someone asked the right question. Still, Kenley didn't arrest him immediately. She wanted to know how deep it went. Were there other accounts, collaborators, more fake orders? She watched another Thursday come and go. This time, something was different. Henry didn't come in at 3:45 a.m. The footage showed nothing. Then at 5:06 a.m., the door opened. Someone else walked in wearing Henry's coat. The figure mimicked his movements, pulled the register drawer, and replaced it expertly. It was Henry. So who was it? The figure on the surveillance footage moved with precision, not hurried, not sloppy. He wore Henry's baker's coat and hat, his gait eerily similar. He unlocked the shop with a key. He navigated the cramped backroom and ovens as though he'd done it dozens of times. If you weren't watching closely, you'd mistake him for Henry himself. But Constable Kenley had been watching closely. The first inconsistency was the height. The man on video stood slightly taller than Henry Dobbins, only by an inch or two, but enough that when standing under the bakery's doorframe, something Henry did dozens of times each morning, the figure's head brushed the wood. Henry never did. Next was the way he handled the dough bins. Henry, being a lifelong baker, had a smooth, almost theatrical method of flipping the bins onto the counter, opening them, and tossing the contents with flair. This man was careful, stiff like someone trained to imitate but lacking the instinct. Kenley leaned back in her desk chair, rewinding the footage again and again. It was Henry, but it was Colin, either too tall, and Colin didn't have keys. Nor was it anyone from the small list of former employees according to bakery records. So, who was it? She decided not to confront Henry immediately. Instead, she visited Colin Marlowe, the apprentice baker. Colin lived in a modest studio apartment above a florist. Nervous and eager, he answered the door in flour-streaked jeans and apologized for the smell sourdough starter, he claimed, bubbling on the windowsill. "I need to ask you something, Colin, about last Thursday morning." He stiffened. "Were you in the shop before 6 a.m.? "No," he said quickly. "Same as always, got there at 6:10. Henry was already baking." "And how do you know it was Henry?" Colin blinked. "What? Was it Henry Dobbins, or someone wearing his coat?" Colin hesitated, his lips parting slightly. I mean, I just assumed it was Henry. He was back in the kitchen with his headphones on when I got in." He nodded, didn't say much. "Was the shop locked when you arrived?" Colin nodded. "Yeah, I used my key to get in." That, Kenley thought, was a problem. The surveillance showed the figure, the imposter, unlocking the door at 5:06 a.m. He never locked it behind him, yet Collins said it was locked at 6:10. Someone had relocked the door after the imposter left, which meant either there were two intrusions that morning or Henry came in later, possibly unaware that someone else had been there first. Or Henry was aware. Kenley now had three theories. Henry was still committing the fraud himself and had enlisted someone else to cover his tracks. Someone close to him was impersonating him to commit the thefts without his knowledge. Henry had been covering up a deeper, longer-running scam involving an accomplice or even multiple ones. The police requested a forensic sweep of the shop. Henry allowed it reluctantly. They dusted the cash drawer, the back office, even the coat hook. No foreign fingerprints turned up. Everything was either wiped clean or belonged to Henry or Colin. Kenley dug deeper. She requested Henry's bank records. She found that the cash deposits hadn't stopped. Even after the weeks when Henry supposedly hadn't committed the fraud himself, the Thursday afternoon deposits remained consistent between £1,000 and £1,500. A quiet red flag. If Henry wasn't committing the theft on the mornings when the imposter was seen, how did he still have the cash to deposit? Unless the imposter was working for him. The financial statements revealed another clue: a recurring transfer every Friday morning from Henry's account to an unnamed payee, routed through a secondary business account under a different business name. Y Valley Baking Institute. A name that appeared nowhere on the bakery's storefront or promotional materials. Kenley followed that lead. The Y Valley Baking Institute was a defunct teaching company registered 4 years earlier and now operating under the radar as a small private kitchen rental and pastry school just outside of Hereford. Run by a man named Peter Dobbins, Henry's cousin. Peter had a criminal record: minor fraud, bounced checks, a shady loan default, but nothing violent. He once worked at Dobbins and Sons in his 20s before leaving the village under a cloud of rumors about gambling and drinking. When Kenley drove to the institute, she found a modest kitchen setup, 2 gas ovens, and a polished counter for demonstrations. Peter wasn't in, but a young woman, a part-time instructor, was there prepping for a croissant class. When asked about the Thursday funding, she admitted Peter always had envelopes of cash, said they were angel investments from family, didn't ask questions. Kenley requested surveillance footage from the building. It showed Peter arriving every Thursday afternoon around 1:00 p.m., same time Henry left the bakery. On the day of the mysterious robbery, he showed up in a hurry, carrying a bag that matched the one used in the bakery footage. It wasn't just fraud, it was organized and familial. Confronted with this evidence, Kenley returned to Henry. They sat in the bakery's tiny back office. The smell of scones and flour hung in the air, but the warmth felt false now. "Henry," Kenley began, "why is Peter robbing your shop?" There was silence. Then, after a long breath, Henry said, "Because I asked him to." The confession came easily, surprisingly so. Henry explained. 3 years ago, Peter returned to Langley-on-Wye after a bad business deal collapsed in Leeds. He was broke, but eager to restart his culinary education dream. Henry, despite their strained past, agreed to help, but he couldn't loan the money outright. His wife handled the books, and their accounts weren't healthy enough to hide large withdrawals. So they devised a method. Every Thursday, Peter would rob the bakery, replacing the till drawer and leaving with a prearranged amount. Henry would file small insurance claims here and there, carefully spaced to avoid red flags. In between, he'd cover it by cooking the books, claiming fake wedding orders and private pastry contracts. It worked too well. They grew bold. They started replacing not just money but goods, bulk butter orders, chocolate, imported vanilla. Peter used these to stock his institute. The fraud sustained them both. "But why the impersonation?" Kenley asked. "Why make it look like you?" To maintain the illusion, Henry said. If it looked like I was being robbed randomly, people would worry, stop coming in. But if it looked like I was still here, working as usual, no one would ask questions. The customers still saw me in the morning, still got their buns. Even Colin. Henry nodded. He's a good kid. I didn't want to involve him. Peter would slip in before he arrived, act like me, say nothing, then leave. Why did it stop? Henry looked down. Because the insurance company started asking questions. Turns out, the pattern of small claims, though subtle, had caught the attention of regional auditors. A red flag was raised 2 weeks earlier. Henry had received a notice of audit but hadn't told Peter. So the last Thursday's job, it wasn't authorized. Peter had acted on his own, perhaps thinking the scheme was still alive. Or perhaps he was escalating it. Kenley wasn't convinced the motive was still joint. The video showed Peter more confident than ever, and Henry's unease told her he might no longer be in control. She filed charges against both men. Peter was arrested the following Friday, en route to the bank with another envelope of cash. In his bag were bakery order slips pre-filled with fictional clients, a second fake till, and a burner phone with weekly reminders labeled Dough Run. Colin was never charged. Henry took full responsibility. But there was still one more question Kenley couldn't answer. Why didn't Henry stop it sooner? He could have come clean when the scheme got out of hand, or when Peter returned without permission, but he didn't. Was it guilt, fear, or something darker, a sense that, in helping Peter, he was repaying a debt the town never knew he owed? And even with Peter arrested, the insurance audit wasn't over. A deeper investigation was underway. What if there were more thefts, ones no one even noticed? For most people in Langley-on-Wye, the idea that Henry Dobbins could be involved in any crime, let alone a long-running fraud, was unthinkable. The man had baked their birthday cakes, catered their weddings, and quietly donated rolls to the church's soup drives. But the warmth of memory couldn't smother the facts. Henry had orchestrated a routine theft of his own business for over 18 months, using his cousin Peter as the phantom culprit and funneling insurance money into a second venture built on lies. And yet, as the official investigations deepened, what seemed like a cleanly wrapped case began to unravel in odd, granular ways, like a poorly folded pastry letting its fillings ooze. The second ledger. 2 weeks after Peter's arrest, as insurance auditors swept through every financial record of Dobbins and Sons, they discovered something the police had missed. A second ledger, handwritten and wedged behind an old tin box of yeast. It wasn't part of the official bookkeeping system. In fact, it didn't match any of the declared records. This second ledger, written in a cramped, slanted scrawl, tracked far more than just petty cash or missing ingredients. It listed names, over 40 of them, with dates, pound amounts, and vague notes like settled, carried, or rolled over. Some had red ink circles. Others had asterisks. One name repeated across nearly every Thursday entry, D. Broyles. Detective Constable Kenley immediately recognized it. David Broyles had been a fixture at the bakery for years, a man in his 60s who swept the streets for the parish council and collected day-old bread at closing. Everyone assumed he was a lonely man with a tight budget and a carb habit. But the entries next to his name suggested a financial relationship far beyond leftover loaves. When interviewed, Broyles initially denied everything. "I just pick up rolls, never paid for them either. Henry always said it was fine." Pressed further, he admitted to being part of what he called a Thursday club. Each Thursday morning before opening hours, a small group of locals met at the back of the bakery. They weren't there for pastries. They were there to gamble. Gambling in the back room. According to Broyles, Henry had created a private betting circle in the bakery's rear pantry. It started casually, football scores, horse races. But within months, it evolved into a structured underground bookie operation. Local residents, often older men or day laborers, placed cash bets on everything from Premier League results to odd markets like weather predictions and televised quiz shows. He always said it was just for fun, Broyle said, but we all knew he was running it like a business. You win, he pays out. You lose, he keeps the stake. Fair and square. The bakery's back room had a second drawer in one of the pastry cabinets, deep enough to hide envelopes, betting slips, even cash bundles. The camera footage hadn't captured it because it was never accessed during the known robberies. Kenley was floored. The fake thefts were just one layer. The insurance fraud hid something else, an illegal gambling den operating in the very early hours, right under the noses of a town that thought of Dobbins and Sons as sacred ground. Henry had been covering more than just his cousin's pastry venture. He had built a system where Thursday morning losses masked the cash flow generated by betting slips. The thefts kept his insurance claims legitimate, allowing him to move money around without drawing attention to the source. In a twisted way, the robbery of his own shop was less of a crime than the truth he was hiding beneath it. A web of small crimes. Once word spread about the gambling, several members of the community came forward, some sheepishly, others angrily. A widow named Muriel Thompson admitted she lost £900 in 3 months betting on cricket scores. A retired butcher claimed he'd won once and was never paid. A part-time teacher swore Henry used bakery funds to cover the debts of preferred players. It was no longer about flour or fake-till drawers. This was about manipulation, secrecy, and control. Henry Dobbins had built a latticework of small crimes, layered so subtly that no single part seemed dangerous, until stacked together. Fraudulent insurance claims, misappropriated bakery income, hidden gambling operations, aiding and abetting Peter's impersonations, falsified orders, improper business disclosures. Each on their own was a misdemeanor or administrative offense, but together, they painted a picture of sustained criminal enterprise. When Kenley confronted Henry with the second ledger, he didn't deny it, but he didn't explain it either. He simply said, people needed something to do, and the town needed to believe in something boring. The court proceedings. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the charges and pursued them under the Proceeds of Crime Act and the Theft Act of 1968. Henry Dobbins faced charges of fraud by false representation, running an illegal betting operation, money laundering, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Peter Dobbins faced similar charges, with an additional count for identity misrepresentation. Henry pled guilty to most of the charges. At sentencing, the judge delivered a statement that reflected the strange nature of the case. This is not a crime of violence, nor one of flamboyance. It is a quiet crime, a creeping deceit built on routine and repetition. Mr. Dobbins exploited his reputation and the goodwill of a town to insulate his actions. But crime, no matter how neatly dressed in flour and powdered sugar, remains crime. Henry received a sentence of 2 years and 8 months, suspended for good behavior due to age and lack of prior offenses. He also forfeited his bakery license. Peter, deemed the more reckless of the two and already with a prior record, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The Wye Valley Baking Institute was shut down within a month. The aftermath in Langley-on-Wye. The village bakery was purchased by a young couple from Bath who rebranded it as the Honest Crust. They kept some of Henry's original recipes, especially the oat rolls, but removed the hidden drawers, replaced the security system, and vowed never to sell more than 20 scones per customer. Colin Marlowe stayed on as head baker. He never spoke publicly about the scandal, but he added a new item to the menu. The Thursday turnover, a flaky pastry stuffed with layers of brown sugar and salted caramel, served only on Thursdays. Locals got the joke, Tourists didn't need to. Constable Kenley finally retired, this time for real. Her last day on the job was spent signing off on the final audit paperwork for the bakery. In her parting remarks, she told the town hall audience, "Sometimes the crimes that matter most don't scream, they whisper, and they hide in places you'd never expect, behind a counter, under a coat, or inside a Thursday routine." She smiled, then added, "And sometimes justice smells like cinnamon." Lingering questions. Even after the trial, a few mysteries never found closure. Several names in the ledger were never identified. Had they been protected, or were some of them aliases? The total amount stolen through insurance fraud was estimated at just over £42,000, but bank records suggested Henry moved more than £60,000 through side accounts. Where was the rest? And perhaps the most curious detail of all, every single Thursday robbery stopped the day after Peter's arrest, but the bakery hadn't been under police watch the week after. No camera, no officers, yet nothing happened. Had someone else been involved, someone who knew when to stop? Or had the system been so finely tuned that it relied on a single domino? We'll never know. Because in the end, Langley-on-Wye moved on. The loaves were still warm, the tea still poured, and on Thursdays the townspeople still lined up outside the bakery, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because, deep down, they liked their crime just boring enough to sleep through. Story 2. The quiet accountant who cooked books for the mob. You probably wouldn't have noticed Martin Kessler if he passed you on the street. He was the sort of man who wore pressed slacks even on weekends, combed his hair with a military neatness, and walked like every step needed to be accounted for. He lived in a narrow terrace in Southend-on-Sea, drove an unremarkable silver Vauxhall Astra, and brought the same lunch to work every day: turkey sandwich, apple, and one digestive biscuit. By all appearances, Martin was just a mid-level accountant working for a small firm called Halley & Sons. But behind those spreadsheets and VAT filings was a man who spent 12 years laundering millions of pounds for one of the most tightly run criminal syndicates in England. And no one noticed, not even his wife. The life of quiet numbers. Halley & Sons was a legitimate firm on paper. Based in a tidy row of Georgian buildings on Clarence Street, the company had a small but loyal client base, mostly family businesses, property developers, and a few import-export outfits. Martin Kessler had worked there since he was 27. He rose quietly through the ranks, eventually managing the small business accounts division, which mostly meant he handled the most mundane clients. Or so everyone thought. In truth, Halley & Sons had one particularly complex client hidden behind a shell company called Chestnut Logistics Limited. The firm supposedly managed warehouse operations across the Thames estuary. In practice, it was a laundering front for the Denton Crew, an East London crime syndicate known for drug trafficking, extortion, and black market weapons. Kessler didn't find the Denton Crew, they found him. The offer. In 2007, Martin was struggling. His wife Julia had recently been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Treatment costs piled up. The NHS covered the essentials, but private care offered a chance at better mobility. Meanwhile, their only child, Amelia, had just started university in York. Martin's salary wasn't enough. They were behind on the mortgage. That's when he was approached. The contact came through a Client A logistics contractor who worked nights at Tilbury Docks. He offered Martin a side job, help streamline shipping invoices for a private consortium that imported large quantities of electronics from Turkey. The pay, £3,000 a week, in cash. Martin hesitated, but the bills didn't. Within 6 months, he was routinely adjusting invoice reports for Chestnut Logistics, reducing VAT exposure, inflating customs duties to hide profits, and balancing fake losses across multiple subsidiaries. He thought that would be the end of it, a temporary fix. But money has a way of encouraging silence. By 2009, Martin wasn't just hiding profits. He was creating entire books of fictitious expenses, ghost employees, non-existent shipments, write-offs on undelivered goods. He wrote software macros that generated fake audit trails. He advised shell companies on how to pose as clients. He even suggested the optimal flow of money between Gibraltar and the Isle of Man to avoid suspicion. The Denton crew noticed, and they kept him. The accountant no one questioned. What made Martin so dangerous wasn't his malice, it was his predictability. He didn't drive flashy cars. He didn't wear expensive suits. He never took long holidays or flaunted wealth. His only extravagance was a small home office with 3 computer monitors and an espresso machine. His wife believed he'd simply gotten better at work. His bosses thought he was a loyal workhorse. In fact, Halley & Sons profited from the extra hours he billed and assumed his work on Chestnut Logistics was just a niche logistics firm. They didn't ask questions. Neither did the HMRC, not at first. Martin knew the laws, knew how to tiptoe around audits. He never falsified individual transactions, he falsified the patterns instead. He manipulated the ebb and flow of financial signals in a way that made everything appear normal. The only people who came close to questioning him were in the criminal world itself. The mistake. In 2015, Martin flagged a concern to his Denton handler. The crew's rapid expansion into Eastern Europe was straining the laundering channels. Too much cash, not enough safe accounts. He proposed a new idea: laundering through crypto assets. He had read early reports about privacy coins and saw a golden opportunity to layer transactions through decentralized exchanges and overseas wallets. The crew agreed. For 2 years, Martin quietly moved nearly £7 million through an intricate web of online wallets, fake exchanges, and overseas incorporations in Estonia and Malta. He even used gaming platforms, allowing thousands of microtransactions to filter through as in-game purchases. But the shift into digital space created noise and drew the attention of the National Crime Agency, NCA. The investigation begins. In 2018, the NCA launched Operation Legifall, an effort to crack down on crypto-based money laundering. Their attention was initially on the Denton crew's street-level crimes, but when tracing money trails backward, they kept landing at the same 3 companies, all with immaculate books, all served by Halley & Sons. One of the agents, Fiona Lee, noticed something strange. Every time a suspicious company closed or was dissolved, a new client appeared in the same industry with near-identical financial behavior. But the names were different, the directors were different. Only the accountant stayed the same, Martin Kessler. The knock at the door. The NCA didn't move quickly. They spent 11 months building a forensic financial profile of Martin's client activity. They traced VPN access logs, cross-referenced blockchain wallets, and pulled digital signatures from cloud accounting software. When they finally arrested him in July 2019, Martin was at home in slippers, editing a macro for automated tax filings. His first words weren't denial, they were, "I was just trying to keep things balanced." He surrendered immediately. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of his involvement unraveled a timeline that revealed over £19.4 million laundered, at least 11 companies created under false pretenses, and 5 foreign exchange schemes built entirely from scratch to serve Denton interests. But it wasn't just numbers. Martin's software was used by other criminal accountants. His methods spread. In multiple interrogations, mid-tier Denton associates referred to the Gray Ghost, a nickname for the man they never saw, only heard about, who could make any problem vanish in a spreadsheet. His legacy was technical genius applied to criminal purpose. The unresolved thought. When asked why he never walked away, Martin gave a quiet answer. "I think I liked being needed. No one else ever needed me like that." His trial would later be described as the least dramatic financial crime hearing in modern British history. He showed no outbursts. He answered questions precisely. He signed a full confession. He even offered to consult for law enforcement. But one detail kept nagging at Agent Fiona Lee. Of all the companies Martin helped create, one remained unreachable, a holding firm listed in Denmark, tied to an Estonian wallet still receiving funds. The money was still moving, but Martin swore he'd shut everything down. So who was keeping the last ledger alive? When authorities arrested Martin Kessler in 2019, they believed they had severed the Denton crew's most sophisticated financial pipeline. 19 million laundered pounds, 11 shell companies, and years of synthetic bookkeeping had all pointed back to one man. But within days of his arrest, the NCA made a troubling discovery. One of the holding firms Kessler had allegedly dismantled was still active. And not just legally active on paper, it was still moving money. The company, Havneskift Holdings, had been registered in Copenhagen 2 years prior under the name of a now-deceased Ukrainian national. Its address was a dental clinic that didn't exist. Its operations listed Maritime Logistics Consulting, but there were no employees, no vessels, and no cargo manifests. Yet every Thursday at exactly 14:00 GMT, transactions between €8,000 and €15,000 were received into its account. The funds were routed through anonymous crypto wallets, mixed via privacy coins, and distributed into a string of small accounts in Latvia, Gibraltar, and the Isle of Man. It was all part of a pattern Kessler had developed, but it was still running, even though he was in custody, denied computer access, and under 24-hour monitoring. Someone else had the keys. The apprentice. Back in Southend-on-Sea, authorities returned to Halley & Sons to begin auditing every file that Martin Kessler had touched in the last decade. They started with Chestnut Logistics, then moved down the list of subsidiaries and dummy companies. But in a folder marked Technical Reference, they found something unexpected. A user manual. Written in clear, instructive language, the manual explained how to use Kessler's proprietary macros to simulate financial activity, automate ledger reconciliations, and even delay audit flags in certain cloud accounting platforms. It was versioned and time-stamped. The most recent update, 6 weeks after Martin's arrest. This wasn't a cold trail. Someone had picked up the work and knew enough to maintain it. Investigators soon turned to Halley & Sons' junior staff. One name rose quickly to the top: Ellis Parnell, age 26, recently promoted to assistant accounts manager. Parnell was a quiet, highly competent employee who had once described Kessler as a human calculator with a monotone. In casual chats, he admitted to admiring Kessler's efficiency. But what no one realized was that Kessler had quietly mentored him, likely passing on encrypted files, custom software tools, and perhaps even passwords to remote servers. When authorities brought Parnell in for questioning, he denied everything, claimed he'd had no access to Kessler's financial macros and no involvement in offshore accounts. But digital forensic analysis told another story. The shadow connection. Investigators found that Parnell had accessed a cloud storage account associated with an encrypted folder labeled Riemann. The name was a reference to Bernhard Riemann, a 19th-century mathematician famous for theorizing about the distribution of prime numbers. To most, it meant nothing. To Martin Kessler, it was a code word, used repeatedly in his handwritten notes and tagged on the internal comments of his software scripts. Whenever a variable or calculation seemed overly complicated, he'd mark it Riemann level adjustment. Parnell hadn't just accessed the folder. He had downloaded its contents multiple times, including the week before the Havnaskift Holdings transactions resumed. He had the manual, he had the macros, and he had motive. Further forensic analysis showed that the IP address used to access the Estonian wallet associated with Havnaskift traced back to a rented co-working space in Leon C., a space Parnell had leased under a pseudonym, E. Riaman. A search warrant was issued. In the rented office they found a password-protected laptop with custom bookkeeping software, dozens of burner phone SIM cards, 2 external SSDs labeled clients and feeds, a paper ledger written in Kessler's handwriting. Most damning of all, a thumb drive with a document named Inheritance Protocol PDF. It outlined contingency steps in case Kessler was arrested or incapacitated. He had planned everything. The protocol. The document was short, barely 3 pages, but it was clear. In the event of his removal from operations, Parnell was to assume responsibility for maintaining 4 key laundering pathways. Havnaskift Holdings, Copenhagen. Levara Group, Malta. Rainbeam Trade, Dubai. Unnamed cash-to-crypto channel via online gaming servers. Each entry came with passwords, scheduled transaction times, and cleanup routines. It wasn't just a contingency. It was a full transition plan. Kessler had been planning for his exit, legal or otherwise, for months. But why Parnell? He was bright but young, quiet but not invisible, an ideal successor, Kessler likely thought, a man with no criminal record, no family ties, and no history with law enforcement. Someone who could vanish into spreadsheets and maintain the illusion of normalcy. Yet Parnell's fatal mistake had been underestimating digital forensics. In trying to cover his trail, he repeated one of Kessler's earliest flaws: predictability. The weekly 14:00 Thursday transfers, the use of Riemann-style algorithms, even the nomming conventions for the cloud files. He had learned everything from Kessler, including, unfortunately, his habits. The confrontation. When Parnell was re-questioned with the new evidence, he broke. He admitted to maintaining Kessler's systems post-arrest, but he claimed Kessler had instructed him to do so not for profit, but to protect the system. Martin said the system had to stay stable, that if the accounts froze, too many people would get hurt. It wasn't about money, it was about control. He refused to say who too many people were. Was it fear of the Denton crew? Or had Kessler convinced his apprentice that their system was bigger than them, that it had to persist? Parnell was arrested, charged with conspiracy to launder funds, and handed over to the cybercrime division. But before he could be moved to secure detention, he attempted to destroy his laptop, smashing it against a wall in the holding room. He failed. The laptop was recovered, and it held one final surprise: the recording. On the hard drive was an audio file labeled Last Notes MK. In it, Kessler's voice, calm even, and dry as ever, delivered what amounted to a confessional manifesto. I never saw myself as a criminal. I saw a system broken, bloated, vulnerable, and I optimized it. I took waste and made it efficient. If I were born in another time, I'd have built a clock tower or an army. Instead, I built a ledger. The work is not mine now. It belongs to itself. The laundering paths are stable, recursive, and redundant. Anyone with the tools can run them. Anyone with the curiosity can modify them. Money is not the goal. It never was. The system must be maintained. Investigators were stunned. This wasn't about desperation anymore. This was about legacy. The bigger picture. The NCA feared that if Kessler's macros and automation scripts had been shared beyond Parnell, the laundering process might outlive both men. It would become self-sustaining, passed down like code, forked like open-source software. Indeed, on dark web forums weeks later, authorities found fragments of Kessler's automation routines being discussed, modified, and offered as templates for smart launders. His name wasn't used, but his ideas had already spread. The unresolved thought. Martin Kessler eventually received a 7-year sentence, with 3 years suspended for cooperation. Parnell took a plea deal for 5. But Havnisgift Holdings, the account stopped transferring money after Parnell's arrest. No more Thursday payments. But 1 year later, a new account registered in Belgium began receiving identically patterned crypto deposits, similar sizes, similar schedules. New name, new interface, same code. Martin Kessler had long since been moved to a low-security facility in Kent. No contact with the outside world, no devices, no visitors outside immediate family. So if it was Kessler, and it was Parnell, who picked up the ledger next? When Martin Kessler was moved to HMP Stanford Hill, a Category D open prison in Kent, most believed that the story of the Grey Ghost, the quiet accountant who had laundered millions for the Denton crew, had reached its quiet, numerical end. But crime, like software, is modular. What Kessler built didn't need him to keep running. And for all the resources the National Crime Agency threw into Operation Legifall, they couldn't track every script, every server, every shadow account. So when Havnisgift Holdings went dark following Ellis Parnell's arrest, there was hope. A line had been cut. The system was collapsing. But that hope didn't last long. Within 9 months, a new company appeared in Ghent, Belgium. Vogt Crans Consulting, registered under an Estonian national with no known digital footprint, began receiving deposits, cryptocurrency transactions ranging from €10,000 to €18,000. They came weekly, on Thursdays. They mirrored the same values, time windows, and laundering behavior first developed by Kessler. But neither Kessler nor Parnell had access, and both denied any knowledge of the new channel. Ghost code. Cybercrime analysts at Europol flagged the similarity of the new laundering pattern to the now-retired Havnisgift Holdings system. It wasn't just the transaction structure, it was the codebase itself. The metadata embedded in the scripts showed version control markers, identical to those used in Kessler's personal software library. But there was one difference: the code had been modified. Someone had stripped out the original author's signatures and replaced the naming conventions. Variables like float vessel became float proxy. Flags for transactional delay buffers were shortened. Logs were rerouted through onion-rooted endpoints. It was as if the code had been handed off and refactored. Investigators feared the worst, that Kessler's operation had gone open source. If true, it would mean that criminal organizations across Europe could now use, modify, and deploy Kessler's systems like plug-and-play modules. From drug cartels to human traffickers, they wouldn't need accountants. They'd need scripts. And the instructions were already circulating in private cybercriminal forums. The breadcrumb. Agent Fiona Lee, who had been chasing Kessler's trail since the beginning, was called back in to consult on this latest chapter. She reviewed Vogt Krans's transaction history and noted something familiar. One of the wallet addresses used in the 4th transaction matched a dormant account flagged 2 years earlier under Operation Legifall. That address had been part of a brief laundering scheme used to fund illegal gambling servers in Montenegro, a side scheme Kessler had reportedly shut down. Only a handful of people would have known about that address. Lee reviewed the full list of Kessler's associates. That's when she found René Vogt. Not a criminal, not a coder, not even European. René had once been a data entry temp at Halley & Sons back in 2012, just 6 months, barely remembered. But in Kessler's own encrypted email dump, A message to an address marked RENEEG included a file labeled Primer 13 with a message. If the game changes, use this instead. You'll know when. It had been sent 2 days before Kessler's arrest. The protégé no one noticed. Renee Vogt was living in Ghent now, working as a freelance bookkeeper for small startups and tech firms. On paper, she was clean. Her taxes checked out. No criminal record. No known associations with the Denton crew. But Europol's surveillance revealed she was accessing anonymous browsers at night, visiting private tech forums, downloading updates to privacy coins, and, most tellingly, logging into shell company management interfaces tied to Vogt crayons. When confronted, Renee didn't deny it. She said she thought the system was already being used by worse people, that her role was just to keep the lights on and let the machine run itself. But why her? Why would Kessler entrust his most advanced laundering framework to a temp from 2012? The answer was buried in a single footnote in his handwritten journal, found only after his conviction. Vogt, the only one who never asked me what a balance meant. She only asked what it did. That's the person you pass the torch to. The court's dilemma. The charges against Renee were hard to nail down. She hadn't stolen money. She hadn't created the system. She hadn't even taken a profit. Most of the crypto she rooted ended up in trust accounts she never touched. It appeared she was running the laundering architecture like a caretaker, not a criminal. But the law couldn't ignore facilitation. Renee was charged with assisting in the operation of an unlicensed financial instrument, conspiracy to conceal criminal property, unauthorized use of financial automation software for illicit gain. She pled guilty to 1 count, received 18 months suspended, plus 5 years of supervised digital access. The courtroom transcript noted her parting statement. "I didn't build the machine, I just oiled it." The legacy of Martin Kessler. Kessler, still incarcerated, refused all interviews following Renee's sentencing. But when informed of her involvement, he reportedly smiled, just once, and said, "It chose her." Despite best efforts, 2 new laundering frameworks were discovered within the next 18 months. Both bore signature hallmarks of Kessler's code: recursive identity masking, delayed transaction layering, Thursday deposits. One was found in Bratislava, the other in Nairobi. Neither had clear authorship. The thought that lingers: when a system is built with such precision, such elegance, and such modular simplicity, it stops being the property of the person who created it. It becomes part of the digital bloodstream of global crime. Martin Kessler never shouted, never threatened, never ran from the law. He simply built something too useful to die. And now, the only question that remains is, how many more copies of the Grey Ghost's ledger are still out there? Story 3. The librarian who stole first editions for 17 years. In the quiet corridors of the Bodmin Public Library, nestled in the heart of Cornwall, nothing ever really changed. The light filtered in through dusted skylights, the smell of old paper mixed with wood polish, and every Thursday at 10:00 a.m., the head librarian wheeled a squeaky cart of returned books past the biography section. Her name was Esther Doyle. She wore cardigans, not coats. Her hair was always tied into a practical knot, and for nearly 3 decades, she was the living embodiment of the building itself, quiet, precise, and slightly faded at the edges. But behind the decimal system, catalog cards, and overdue notices, Esther ran one of the longest-running and most meticulously executed rare book thefts in British history. It took 17 years for anyone to notice. The quiet disappearance of culture. Rare books don't usually vanish loudly. Unlike art heists or jewelry thefts, the removal of a first edition from a library's special collection doesn't set off sirens. Most libraries don't even inventory their rare holdings more than once a year, some once a decade. In Bodmin, the special collection room was a locked side annex of the second floor. It contained signed copies, first editions, and limited prints dating back to the late 1700s. Among them were a 1922 Ulysses by James Joyce, a signed 1954 Lord of the Flies, a first printing of The Hobbit, 1937, George Allen and Unwin, a limited illustrated edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Mervyn Peake, several rare religious tracts from the 19th century. For years, the collection was treated less like a museum and more like a forgotten treasure chest. Access required a key. Only 2 staff members held one. Esther Doyle was one of them. The other, her assistant, was fired in 2004 for persistent tardiness. From that point forward, Esther was the only one with access. A routine inventory and a missing giant. In 2020, during a post-lockdown audit, a visiting preservation specialist from Exeter noted that the Ulysses entry was missing from the library's rare book catalog. The shelf where it had previously sat bore a sticker, but no book. At first, the assumption was simple. It had been sent for repair, but there was no record of that. Then came the second red flag. The Hobbit was listed in the catalog, but not in the locked case. In its place was a facsimile edition, a high-quality replica published in 2000, nearly identical in appearance. Someone had switched it. An internal audit of the rare collection was ordered. When it finished 6 weeks later, the final count was devastating: 41 rare titles missing. Most had been replaced with modern reprints, aged and dusted to blend in with their neighbors. Esther Doyle, the one person who had overseen that room for more than 20 years, was asked to attend a meeting. She arrived on time as always, brought shortbread, denied everything. The detective who loved books. Because the estimated value of the missing items exceeded £500,000, the case was escalated to the Devon and Cornwall police. It landed on the desk of Detective Inspector Leona Parrish, who had a background in antiquarian books and a personal affection for libraries. She immediately noted something critical. The missing volumes weren't random. They were targeted. These weren't just any rare books. They were first editions, signed by author or illustrator. Books likely to fetch 5-figure sums at international auctions. Carefully cataloged but infrequently checked. This was not a spur-of-the-moment theft. It was a long game. Parrish requested metadata from the library's archive management system, including access logs to the rare collection room. But the system was outdated, and key logs had been deleted prior to 2017. So Parrish did something unconventional. She asked for Esther's scheduling records. The results stunned her. Every 2 months, almost without fail, Esther had scheduled herself for after-hours sorting on a Friday evening. The library was closed to the public, and she claimed to use the time to reorganize returned donations or weed out duplicates. But each of those Fridays aligned closely with the estimated disappearance window of another title. And even more compelling, on at least 6 occasions, Esther had scheduled a 2-day leave immediately after one of those late nights. Parrish suspected that she used Friday nights to remove the books, then traveled Saturday morning to offload them. But how? The discreet dealers. Rare books aren't like paintings. You don't move them through underworld channels. You sell them quietly through auction houses, estate sales, or private collectors. Parrish reached out to 3 major auction houses: Bonhams, Sotheby's, and Christie. Within weeks, Bonhams confirmed that 3 titles from their 2014 private sale catalog matched descriptions of missing Bodmin copies, including the Ulysses, complete with marginalia that the library had recorded in 1998. The seller, an anonymous consignor working through an intermediary dealer based in Lichfield, Staffordshire. Parrish traced the intermediary. His name was Bernard Hywell, an antiquarian dealer who operated under the shop name Oak and Quill. He specialized in estate clearances and obscure literary items. When questioned, Hywell admitted he had sold over a dozen first editions on behalf of an anonymous woman between 2007 and 2019. He only knew her as Miss Emma. Her method: she would meet in person once every 6 months, hand him a package wrapped in archival paper, and provide a typed sheet listing each book's provenance, often referencing fabricated estate names. He paid her in cash or in silver bullion at her request. She never left contact details. But when he showed Parrish the receipts, one name kept showing up on the inventory forms under prepared by E. Doyle. She didn't even bother to change her initials. The break-in that was. With mounting evidence, a search warrant was issued for Esther's home. To most, it appeared as unassuming as she was. Doilies on the tables, cat figurines on shelves, jars of jam arranged by fruit type. But in her attic, hidden behind an armoire, officers found a false wall. Behind it was a climate-controlled room. Inside were 17 rare books listed as missing. Humidity gauges calibrated for leather binding preservation. Archival boxes marked with false estate names. A notebook listing what appeared to be buyer initials and estimated pricing. She was arrested without incident. When asked why she had done it, Esther's answer was chillingly calm. Because I loved the books more than they did. The philosophy of possession. In her subsequent interviews, Esther described herself not as a thief, but a custodian. They were gathering dust. People borrowed thrillers and cookbooks. Nobody asked for Joyce. Nobody wanted Hardy unless it was for school. She believed that by extracting the rare titles, preserving them, and eventually placing them with people who appreciated them, she was saving them. Never mind that she profited, that she lied, that she created facsimiles to hide the theft. The library is a place of stories, she told D.I. Parrish. This was mine. The unresolved thought. In the weeks following her arrest, only 27 of the 41 missing titles were recovered. The rest vanished into private collections, possibly overseas, never to return. And one troubling fact remained. The list in Esther's attic included 6 titles that were never reported missing. When the library staff reviewed their catalog, they realized something horrifying. Those 6 books had never been inventoried, meaning Esther had likely stolen them years earlier, before any official tracking began. And on the final page of her notebook in pencil was a short, ominous sentence. Not everything was taken. After Esther Doyle's quiet arrest, Bodmin Library became the unlikely center of national attention. The idea that a mild-mannered librarian could have pulled off a 2-decade theft of cultural heritage right under everyone's noses fascinated the public. But behind the headlines and archival dust, a much darker picture was forming. Esther wasn't just a rogue book thief. She was a forger, a fence, and possibly the centerpiece of a network of illicit literary trade that extended far beyond the walls of the library she claimed to protect. And if her final note, not everything was taken, was to be believed, the investigation was far from over. The Attic Archive. D.I. Leona Parrish returned to the Doyle house with a forensic document team. The false wall in the attic, once thought to be the only hiding place, revealed a second layer, a panel concealed by insulation and thin plywood. Inside, 2 metal lockboxes. The first contained more archival materials: aged paper, bindings, stamping tools, embossing powder, gold leaf, and a magnifying visor with LED lighting. Esther had forged ex libris labels, the ownership stamps placed inside rare books, allowing her to remove and replace identifiers. Her system was methodical. Use steam and a flat iron to lift the original library plate. Insert a replica ex libris from a defunct estate, usually invented. Place the original in an acid-free sleeve and record the original shelf mark in her notebook. It was the rare book version of laundering. The second lockbox contained a USB drive, 2 passports, 1 real, 1 forged, and an envelope of foreign bank statements. The USB drive held scanned documents, many of them invoices from book dealers across Europe. She hadn't just sold rare books, she had bought them too. At least 12 first editions not previously in the library's collection had passed through her hands. Some had been sold again, others had simply vanished. The implication was clear. Esther Doyle was running a black market rare book dealership. And she'd done so under the nose of the very institution she'd served for 30 years. The dealer's trail. The dealers she'd used were discreet, mostly older antiquarians and private collectors in Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. Each transaction was small enough to avoid red flags, typically under 10,000 euros, and payments were made using old-fashioned wire transfers to foreign accounts under aliases like C. Denham and T. Fenwick. The paper trail led Parrish to a small shop in Ghent, Bokemer Amstel, owned by a man named Elias van Groot. Van Groot was an antiquarian of the old world, suited, bespectacled, fluent in 4 languages. When shown photos of Esther, he hesitated, then poured 2 cups of black tea. "Yes," he said, "I know her, not by name, we called her the binder." According to Van Groot, the binder came in twice a year and always carried 1 book, never more. Always first editions, always authentic. She never haggled, never provided identification, never sold the same genre twice in a row. She understood rarity and restraint, he said. He believes she worked on behalf of a private collector. She said once quietly that she didn't want the books to end up in the hands of people who just liked the smell. She wanted them read, but not touched. Parrish asked if Van Groot still had any books he'd bought from her. He did. 2 of them. And 1 bore a faint Bodmin library stamp, only visible under UV light. The missing list. Back in Bodmin, the library had begun its own internal audit, separate from the criminal investigation. What they found shocked them even more than the 41 confirmed stolen titles. Over the course of her tenure, Esther had deliberately altered catalog records, removing entries, modifying call numbers, and falsifying circulation histories. Books hadn't just disappeared from shelves, they had vanished from history. One particularly telling record was for a signed 1915 edition of Rupert Brooke's 1914 and Other Poems. The library once held a copy, according to a 1984 printed inventory. But in the digital catalog, it was marked as weeded in 1999. There was no paperwork to support that. A deeper search found over 60 entries with similar annotations. Deaccessioned. Donated away. Lost in renovation. Recycled. None had paperwork. None were discussed in staff meetings. And in most cases, no one but Esther had access to those sections. What this meant was staggering. The confirmed 41 stolen titles were only part of the theft. The actual number might be more than double. The philosophy of theft. Parrish arranged a second interview with Esther, now in custody at HMP Eastwood Park. She brought a copy of the library's 1984 inventory list, annotated with missing titles. Esther glanced at the list, then at Parrish, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Most of those were gifts. They were never really wanted. Parrish pressed her on the forgery equipment, the invoices, the vanishing records. Esther didn't deny anything. "I didn't do it for money. I did it because no one noticed them. No one touched them. They were fading. I don't like waste. When asked what she meant by not everything was taken, Esther looked out the window for a long time. Then quietly she said, "There are things the library didn't even know it owned." The secret shelf. During further renovations at Bodmin Library, a carpenter removing paneling behind the upstairs poetry section discovered a false wall cavity. Inside, wedged between insulation and old plaster, was a wooden crate. Wrapped in wax paper and linen sleeves were 8 rare volumes, including a 1594 edition of The Faerie Queene, a signed copy of Wilfred Owen's poems, 1920, an early medical anatomy manuscript from 1732. Each bore no visible library mark. Parrish theorized these were too valuable to risk fencing. But they also weren't catalogued. So how did Esther know they existed? Simple, she had catalogued them herself. They had been bequeathed to the library in the 1980s by a dying scholar. Esther, a junior archivist at the time, had accepted the delivery, and she had never told anyone. She had curated her own hidden collection, stored in a building she controlled, wrapped in the illusion of order. It wasn't theft in her mind. It was preservation. The unresolved thought Esther Doyle was eventually convicted of: theft of cultural property, forgery of public records, conspiracy to sell stolen artifacts, possession of false documents. Her sentence, 6 years and 4 months. She never apologized, never asked for leniency, and never revealed the full extent of her inventory manipulations. More books may be hidden, in Bodmin or elsewhere. And one lingering question remains: how many custodians like her are out there, quietly rewriting history, one shelf at a time? By the time Esther Doyle stood trial, the case had captivated bibliophiles, archivists, and investigators alike. A seemingly quiet woman, an avatar of order and literacy, had not only betrayed the institution she served, but exposed the alarming fragility of archival trust itself. Yet despite the convictions, the courtroom revelations, and the careful inventory reconciliations, there remained a sense that Esther had not told the whole story. She had spent 17 years removing books, but only 41 had been accounted for. And now the attention turned to what remained hidden. A whisper from the past. During her pre-sentencing interview, Esther was asked, once more, if any more volumes had yet to be recovered. She offered a simple reply: "I left behind more than I took, but the ones I left behind are the ones no one wanted." Detective Inspector Leona Parrish, now nearing retirement herself, took that as a challenge. And so began the final phase of the investigation, not into what had been stolen but what had never been seen. She revisited the handwritten accession logs from the 1970s through the early 1990s, comparing them against both physical holdings and digital records. She noticed something peculiar. Entire categories of donations, often from deceased academics or local estates, were logged once, then never re-entered into any subsequent audits. At first glance, it looked like clerical oversight. But patterns emerged. Books from one estate, Dr. Harriet Finley, a Victorian literature scholar, were marked arrived to be sorted, and then never appeared again. A physical search of the general fiction section turned up nothing. Parrish requested access to the library's basement records room, long unused, and known to be partly water-damaged. There, behind warped shelves and mildewed papers, she found 5 plastic bins, unmarked, unlogged, and wrapped in decades-old tarpaulin. Inside were first editions and unpublished manuscripts, many bearing donor slips dated between 1986 and 1992. One book had a yellowed post-it: "Too valuable to shelve. Move upstairs when possible. E." The Forgotten Archive. Esther hadn't just stolen. She had curated. In interviews, it became clear that her motivations weren't purely criminal, nor fully ethical. She had taken it upon herself to become an arbiter of value. If a book was, in her mind, neglected or improperly appreciated, she moved it, sometimes to her attic, sometimes into the market, and sometimes she simply hid it. One of the more haunting discoveries came in the form of a locked cabinet found during library renovations in a long-sealed records closet. When forced open, it contained 22 books, all high value, and all wrapped in parchment, bound by twine, and labeled in Esther's tiny script. Kept due to fragility. Too valuable to catalog. Would never be read. Safest here. They included a presentation copy of Frankenstein, 1831 edition, a 1793 edition of The Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, a signed, uncorrected proof of The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. The total value was estimated at over £300,000. Each book had been willfully erased from record, not sold, not donated, not even catalogued. They had simply been put away. The court's uncomfortable truth. During sentencing, the court faced a complex dilemma. Esther had clearly stolen. She had forged, laundered, and manipulated records. But she had also preserved. Many of the rescued books had survived thanks to her protective handling, stored in conditions better than the rest of the library could offer. Leather hadn't cracked, pages hadn't foxed, margins were intact. Some books were returned in better shape than when they had arrived. The judge's statement captured the tension perfectly. You acted as a guardian in your own mind, but guardianship without accountability is not stewardship, it is theft. Libraries are not museums, nor are they vaults. They are public trusts. You broke that trust. Esther said nothing in her defense. Her final act in court was to return a single item from her coat pocket. A Bodmin Public Library borrowing slip, dated 1985. The title, The Book Thief. A joke, perhaps, or something closer to confession. The dispersed legacy. Even after sentencing, the ripples of Esther's crime continued. Bodmin Library instituted sweeping changes. All special collection materials were transferred to climate-controlled storage. A third-party audit team was hired to conduct biannual checks. The cataloging system was overhauled to include RFID tags and forensic UV markers. A full-time rare materials librarian was hired from the British library system. But even with these changes, not everything could be fixed. Many of the books Esther sold were now in private hands, beyond the reach of recovery. Buyers in the rare book world were rarely willing to part with their acquisitions, especially those purchased through indirect channels where provenance had been deliberately obscured. One such item, a signed 1924 A Passage to India, was tracked to a collector in Canada. Despite the strong evidence that it had originated in Bodmin, the collector refused to return it without compensation, citing good faith purchase. The library lacked the legal budget to pursue it. It remained gone. A loss not just to the collection, but to the public who had once owned it. Esther Doyle today. After serving just under 4 years of her 6-year sentence, Esther Doyle was released early for good behavior and health reasons. She declined all interviews. She was last seen living in a modest cottage outside Truro, surrounded by potted herbs, with no computer, no car, and no visible connection to the world of books. Former colleagues who visited her after release described her as sharper than ever, but absolutely unrepentant. She doesn't regret it, one said. Not even a little. She thinks the books are safer now. She lives alone, receives no visitors, and keeps one room in her home locked. The thought that lingers. In the end, Esther Doyle forced the literary world to confront a troubling question. Who truly protects culture? Is it the institutions that lock it away? The collectors who hoard it? The readers who forget it? Or the thieves who, in their own warped logic, claim to love it more than anyone else? One title in the Bodmin Library, rediscovered after years in shadow, held an anonymous note in its front leaf. History is a catalog of what we choose to keep, and a mystery of what we let go. Esther had chosen what to keep. But no one, not even her, knows what we lost. Story 4. The Funeral Director's Side Hustle. It's not unusual for people to speak about funeral directors in hushed tones. Their job is close to death, and with that comes a certain mystique, respect mixed with discomfort, professionalism masked with empathy. But in the quiet Norfolk village of East Winford, one man turned that sacred trust into a personal profit engine. His name was Malcolm Price. By all appearances, he was what you'd expect: tailored black suits, soft-spoken words, a solemn nod that told grieving families they were being heard. He ran Price and Sons Funeral Services, a business he had inherited from his father and built into the most trusted name in the region. What no one knew was that, for almost 9 years, Malcolm Price had been running a scheme so bizarre, so darkly entrepreneurial, that it shocked both regulators and the families he served. He had turned death itself into a side hustle, a multi-pronged operation involving the illegal resale of cremation plots, double stacking of coffins, and in one appalling case, the falsification of cremation remains. A quiet industry with no oversight. The funeral industry, particularly in rural England, operates on tradition and discretion. Most regulatory checks are paper-based. Crematoriums and cemeteries often rely on trust between operators, local councils, and funeral homes. Price understood this better than anyone. He had served as the unofficial custodian of 3 small cemeteries and a regional crematorium contract for nearly a decade. Records were kept by hand in large bound ledgers. Cemetery staff were part-time. Cremation paperwork passed through his office before anywhere else. And that control allowed him to begin manipulating the dead for the living. The first hint of trouble. In March of 2021, a local couple, Graham and Patricia Elder, requested the transfer of their late daughter's ashes, held in a temporary urn by Price's facility, to a burial plot they'd recently purchased in Wales. But when the urn was collected and weighed during reinterment preparation, something seemed off. It was too light. An independent lab analysis revealed the contents were not consistent with cremated human remains. Instead, they were fireplace ash, with traces of carbonized wood and minor household debris. The family was devastated. Police were notified. Price offered a vague apology, claiming a labeling mix-up, but his apology sparked more suspicion than comfort. A formal investigation was opened by Norfolk Constabulary, in coordination with the Human Tissue Authority. What they found unearthed years of deception. The double-stack scheme. One of the most shocking discoveries came from exhumation orders at St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, an old, stone-walled plot on the edge of East Winford, where Price and Sons conducted most of their burials. When authorities opened 6 graves flagged by the investigation, they found a disturbing pattern. 2 coffins per grave. No dual-occupancy registration. Upper casket was unrecorded in official cemetery logs. Lower coffin belonged to the registered decedent. Upper coffin belonged to someone from another funeral, held within a 48-hour window. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate duplication of use. The logistics were simple. Instead of buying a new burial plot for each client, Price would stack an unregistered coffin above another, then seal the grave. He would still charge the full price, averaging £2,000 to £3,500 per burial, but wouldn't register the grave with the council. Instead, the paper trail would claim the burial took place in a different plot, one that was either vacant or long dormant. This created phantom graves. When relatives visited the site marked in their documentation, they paid their respects at an empty patch of grass, while the actual body lay elsewhere, sharing a grave with someone completely unrelated. The phantom cremations. Equally disturbing was what happened inside the crematorium. While the cremation furnace logs matched the number of services conducted, analysts found that cremation certificates were falsified in at least 12 cases. Here, how it worked. The deceased would be cremated normally, and their ashes stored in a labeled container. For certain clients, usually those without local family or in cases where ashes were to be scattered by, would withhold the actual ashes and instead fill the urn with generic ash matter. The original ashes were then stored, combined, and later resold in bulk to companies abroad claiming to use ancestral ash for synthetic diamond jewelry and novelty urn products. It was, in essence, a macabre recycling operation. Authorities discovered 3 such contracts with low-oversight companies in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. One invoice from a firm in Slovakia requested minimum 2 kg human cremains, no packaging required. Each sale netted price an average of £200 to £500. Multiplied over years, and with dozens of undocumented urns stored at his facility, the estimated profit exceeded £85,000. The employee who came forward. The investigation may never have gone as deep without the testimony of Rachel Keene, a former mortuary assistant who worked part-time for Price and Sons between 2017 and 2020. She described an operation where everything appeared by the book, but where records didn't always match reality. Sometimes we'd prep a body for burial and the coffin would disappear for hours. Malcolm would say it was early transfer paperwork, or that the family changed burial sites last minute. She also recalled hearing him joke to junior staff. 1 hole, 2 souls keeps the cost down. It hadn't registered at the time, but after the news broke about the elder family, she contacted police. Her logs and phone photos helped corroborate at least 7 double-stacked burials. A man without remorse. When finally brought in for formal questioning, Malcolm Price didn't deny most of the accusations. He called it industry efficiency. The families got their closure. The council got their records. The ashes were scattered. What's the difference? He believed he had done nothing morally wrong, just streamlined a business mired in red tape and excess cost. When shown evidence of false remains, he said, "Ash is ash, no one questions the sky." He showed no remorse, no regret, no acknowledgement of the deep emotional harm he had caused. The unresolved thought. As police prepared charges and families began civil proceedings, one chilling question remained. How many more? Price and Sons had operated for 28 years. The double stacking appeared to begin around 2012. The cremation discrepancies likely started even earlier. Cemetery records prior to 2010 were handwritten. Many plots lacked full registration. Some graves had no living relatives left to report inconsistencies. And the urn storage facility was incomplete. Several boxes had no labels. Others appeared tampered with. Authorities admitted they may never know the true number of victims. The dead had no voice. And Malcolm Price had made sure the paperwork was silent too. The fallout from the Malcolm Price case swept through Norfolk like a storm. In the village of East Winford, the churchyard felt heavier, the headstones quieter. Families once comforted by the professionalism of Price and Sons were now doubting the very location of their loved ones. More than 60 burial certificates issued by Price between 2012 and 2021 were flagged for review. The problem: cemeteries lacked sufficient record-keeping. Many local councils had never verified that burials occurred where documented. In some cases, they never visited the sites at all. For the families left behind, there was only one question: where are our dead? The audit. Following the cremation fraud scandal, the Norfolk County Council convened a special burial oversight task force. Their mission: audit every grave, cremation, and service handled by Price and Sons over a 10-year period. Within weeks, red flags began to multiply. Grave 5B in St. Bartholomew's, for example, was registered as occupied by Margaret Linney, buried in April 2018. But when the task force reviewed cemetery logs, they discovered the plot had previously been recorded as filled in 1994, with Gerald Quinn, a war veteran. No exhumation order had ever been filed. No consent from Gerald's family was documented. When the site was scanned with ground-penetrating radar (GPR), the result was clear: 2 coffins stacked. In another case, Grave 11A was sold to 3 different families over 5 years, each believing they had exclusive rights. GPR confirmed only one burial, a person unrelated to any of the 3. The others had been buried elsewhere, in undocumented locations or plots belonging to others. Each time, the families had paid full price. Malcolm Price had collected the fees. The council had stamped the forms. Nobody checked. The profit model. The math behind Price's operation was deceptively simple. Standard burial plot sale, £3,000. Cremation fee, one £200, one £500. Headstone placement, service packages, additional arrangements, up to £5,000. By reusing graves, falsifying cremation remains, and reselling urns, Price could effectively double his income per client, with virtually no added cost. And he was smart about timing. He targeted elderly individuals with no next of kin, families requesting no-fuss burials, cases involving cremation with scattering, no physical site to verify. He also kept a rotating schedule, never conducting more than 1 suspicious transaction per week and alternating burial locations between cemeteries. He spaced cremation discrepancies months apart to avoid pattern detection. One particularly cunning maneuver was Price's manipulation of pre-need funeral plans. Over 40 clients had paid for funeral services in advance, often a decade prior. Some of them passed away without relatives. Others were institutionalized. In at least 10 cases, no burial ever occurred. Price had filed paperwork stating they were cremated and scattered, but no ashes were stored and no cremation logs existed. It was, in essence, ghost burials. The payments were real. The funerals weren't. The cremation ring. A breakthrough came when Interpol responded to UK inquiries about international transactions related to cremation material. They had been monitoring a Serbian-based company, Vitrilex Memorial Works, which advertised bespoke keepsake urns filled with ancestral ash. Clients believed the ash was symbolic or provided from a known source. But the source, as Interpol had learned, was often purchased bulk cremains from questionable suppliers. Price had sold to them under the name MP Trade Holdings, registered out of a virtual office in Liverpool. Between 2015 and 2021, he had invoiced over 200 kg of ash, split into 2 kg shipments. Each sale was coded as non-human mineral dust. Interpol confirmed that forensic analysis of Vitrilex shipments matched the chemical profile of cremated human remains. The implication: Price was exporting ashes, some mixed, some from unidentified individuals, to foreign buyers. To Vitrilex, it was just product. To Price, it was revenue. To grieving families, it was the betrayal of everything they trusted. The toll on the living. The emotional cost of the fraud was incalculable. A woman named Nancy Wren had buried her husband, Philip, in 2017 at Woodcroft Cemetery. When the audit began, she was contacted by the task force and told that her husband's grave could not be verified. Nancy had visited the site every week for years, planted flowers, read aloud to the headstone. But GPR confirmed it was empty. Philip had been cremated, and Price had claimed his ashes were scattered on request. Nancy never made that request. In reality, no ashes remained. His remains had likely been sold abroad or worse, disposed of without ceremony. Nancy collapsed upon hearing the news. Her words, later recorded in a public inquiry hearing, would resonate with grieving families across the country. "He died once, but now I feel like I lost him again, this time to a lie." The trial. Malcolm Price was charged with 17 counts of fraud, 11 counts of handling human remains unlawfully, multiple violations of burial regulations under the Burial Act, 1857, cremation certification fraud, exporting human remains without permit, theft. During trial, he maintained his demeanor, calm, even composed. When asked why he did it, he said, "Because the system made it easy, because the oversight was lazy, and because I could." His defense attempted to frame the crimes as procedural irregularities, but the scale and consistency made the argument laughable. He was convicted on all counts. His sentence, 18 years in prison with no chance of parole before 13. The judge described his actions as a cruel monetization of grief and death, executed with a chilling sense of logic and a total absence of humanity. The ongoing investigation. Even after sentencing, the case did not close. Over 150 burial records remain under review. 33 urns in Price's storage facility have no labels. At least 2 cemeteries are suspected of having unauthorized burials beyond what was documented. International authorities are tracking other potential buyers of Price's ash exports. Councils across the UK began reviewing their funeral oversight procedures, especially in rural and semi-private facilities. Some discovered minor irregularities, but none yet on the scale of Price and Sons. Still, the fear remains. If one man could do this for nearly a decade, how many others have done it quietly and never been caught? The unresolved thought. The dead cannot speak. They rely on the living to honor them, to remember them, to bury them with dignity, and to scatter them where they wished. But Malcolm Price showed that even in death, people can be used, not for remembrance but for revenue. He turned funerals into margins. He turned mourning into invoices. And even now, years later, families are left to wonder, who was really buried beneath their feet? When the final judgment was handed down in R.V. Price, the courtroom was silent, not in satisfaction, but in stunned disbelief. 18 years. It was among the longest sentences ever given for fraud involving funeral services in the United Kingdom. But Malcolm Price had not just stolen money. He had stolen trust, desecrated memory, and rewritten grief. And as the headlines faded, the real work began, piecing together the long, dark ledger of the dead. The Recovery Unit. In the aftermath of the conviction, Norfolk County Council established a specialized team, the Bereavement Integrity and Recovery Unit, BIRU. Staffed by forensic archaeologists, mortuary technicians, and archivists, its purpose was singular: to restore what dignity can be restored. BIRU's mission was not to punish, but to verify, correct, and inform. They began a meticulous comparison of every record issued by Price and Sons with council logs, cemetery blueprints, and crematorium manifests. The findings were bleak. 61 graves were confirmed to have been tampered with or misrepresented. 21 urns were filled with non-human materials, ash, soil, even sawdust. 14 prepaid funeral contracts were never fulfilled. At least 5 individuals listed as cremated had in fact been buried, unmarked and unrecorded. One particularly cruel twist: in 3 cases, cremated remains had been mixed together, possibly due to either laziness or to fulfill multiple requests with insufficient ash volume. The result: families receiving someone else's loved one, or a stranger, or no one at all. Rewriting death. For the victims' families, the question wasn't just where is the body, it was what now. Some chose to exhume and rebury correctly. Others opted to rescatter what remained. Many, perhaps most, were left with an unfillable void. Like George Holloway, whose mother had been buried in what turned out to be an unused plot. Her real grave was never found. The headstone he'd visited for years, decorative. His response was published in the Eastern Times. "You grieve a death once, but this was like digging it up again. I don't know where she is. I don't know if I ever will." Others tried to hold onto whatever closure they could salvage. A small plaque now sits in Woodcroft Cemetery, placed by a group of families. "For those misplaced but never forgotten, may peace reach you wherever you rest." The wider pattern. Though Malcolm Price's crimes shocked the region, they also uncovered a national blind spot. Across the UK, rural funeral homes operate with minimal oversight. Council cemetery registers are often maintained by a single clerk. Burial records are handwritten, urn contents unverified, and prepaid funeral plans treated with little more than handshake agreements. After the scandal, 21 councils conducted internal reviews. At least 4 found procedural vulnerabilities. One crematorium lacked logs for 14 weeks due to clerical turnover. A rural cemetery in Cumbria had no map of grave allocations. Plots were recorded only in a single staff member's notebook. A facility in Lincolnshire had reused a burial plot without authorization after assuming the family had moved abroad. None reached the scale or intent of Price's scheme, but the message was clear. If someone wanted to do what Price did, they could. What Price never said. Malcolm Price never offered a full confession. He admitted to record-keeping mistakes, to occasional efficiencies, but the full scope, the deliberate double burials, the ash-for-cash exports, the ghost funerals, was never truly explained by him. His personal notes, recovered from his office, were maddeningly cold. Plot 8C, double opportunity, clearance noted. No family, reassign after 2 years. Ashes for Baltic client, label misprint, fix Monday. He kept no journal, no letters, no attempts at emotional justification. The closest thing to reflection was a line scrawled at the top of an invoice. If they can't speak, they can't object. The ethical vacuum. Among funeral professionals, Price's actions created an identity crisis. Trade associations rushed to issue statements. Industry newsletters published long op-eds on the duty of dignity. But behind closed doors, many admitted what had long been whispered. There are no cameras, no audits, no one checks a casket before it's lowered, no one opens an urn to confirm the ash, it's all trust. Some called for reforms. Barcode tagging of remains. Independent verification of cremation and burial logs. Annual audits of funeral homes, especially in rural areas. Standardized urn sealing and DNA testing protocols. Others argued these were impossible under current funding models. As one official put it, "We've left grief in the hands of paperwork, and we just found out what happens when the paperwork lies." The aftermath for East Winford. Price and Sons was dissolved within a month of the verdict. Its headquarters, once the stony heart of the town's rituals, now sits shuttered. The windows are boarded, The sign has been removed. But the town has not forgotten. At St. Bartholomew's, a small memorial garden has been planted for those affected by the scandal. It features a sculpture, a circle of empty chairs around a closed casket. The plaque reads, "In memory of those who trusted and were taken." Families still visit, but they walk the path slower now. They glance at the grass differently. They pause longer before walking away. The thought that lingers: funerals are not for the dead. They are for the living, to witness, to close, to let go. Malcolm Price knew that, and he exploited it, the trust, the sorrow, the finality. He knew no one would open a grave, no one would weigh an urn, no one would think to question him, because death is sacred and the people who guide us through it are supposed to be as well. But in this case, one man found profit in our most vulnerable hour. He buried people twice, and he betrayed them both times. Story 5. The milkman who vanished with the neighborhood savings. In the tight-knit village of Hawksbridge, just north of Sheffield, everyone knew Trevor Mallory. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, never missed a doorstep, and still carried a handbell to announce his rounds. Every morning, without fail, Trevor would navigate the cobbled streets in his dented white van, delivering pints of semi-skimmed milk, eggs, and the occasional loaf of crusty bread. In return, he received not just payments, but trust. So when he vanished one April morning in 2013, leaving behind a route half-finished and dozens of unanswered knocks, people didn't assume crime. They assumed something terrible had happened. What they didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that Trevor hadn't just disappeared. He had taken £212,000 in neighborhood savings with him. The unofficial bank of Hawksbridge. To understand how a village milkman could make off with such a large sum of money, you have to understand the nature of Hawksbridge itself. A population of 1,800, one post office, no local bank since 2006, and a community that prided itself on informality. Everything worked on handshakes. Trevor had grown up there. His father had been the milkman before him. When Trevor inherited the route, he also inherited a reputation for being reliable, humble, and utterly trustworthy. That trust extended far beyond dairy. In 2008, after helping an elderly neighbor deposit her pension into a difficult-to-reach post office savings account, word began to spread. Trevor helps with the banking too. Soon, others started handing Trevor sealed envelopes with cash and deposit slips. He offered to take them into Sheffield once a week and deposit the money at the high street branches. He refused tips. "Happy to help," he'd always say. It started here, £80 there. By 2010, he was handling deposits for over 40 households. It was never formal. No contracts, no logbooks, just trust, a nod, and a man with a thermos and a milk crate. The disappearance. April 2nd, 2013 was a typical Tuesday. Trevor made his first few deliveries on time. Neighbors saw him. Children waved. Then he stopped responding to texts. His van was later found parked behind a disused shed at the edge of town. Inside were 16 crates of milk, untouched. His coat was hanging neatly on the passenger seat. At his home, the lights were off. His dog Daisy was gone, so was his passport. There was no note, no sign of foul play, no struggle. Within hours, rumors swirled. A breakdown, an abduction, suicide. But no body was found. Then, a day later, Mrs. Pauline Fitch, a pensioner, phoned her bank. She was concerned because she hadn't received confirmation for the £1,500 she'd sent with Trevor the previous week. The bank had no record of the deposit. By Friday, 6 other people had called in with similar concerns. And just like that, the milkman who was once trusted with breakfast and banking became the center of an unexpected investigation. The missing ledger. The South Yorkshire Police opened a missing persons case, initially unaware of the financial implications. But as neighbors stepped forward with stories of informal deposits, the scope widened. Inside Trevor's home, everything was remarkably clean, too clean. His bookshelves were dusted, beds made, the fridge emptied. On the desk was a torn envelope addressed to whom it may concern. Inside, a single £20 note and the words, "Everyone wanted to believe, I just helped them along." There was no sign of his personal banking records. But in a biscuit tin under his bed, investigators found a handwritten list titled Milk and Money, running total. Each entry had a name, a number, and a single-digit code. Example: L. Briggs 480 R. J. Anders 700 P. M. Lewiston 2100 R. P. Fitch 1500 C. There were 49 names in total. The cumulative total, £212,000. A gentle thief. As details emerged, the town was divided. Some refused to believe it. Trevor would never, they said. He's probably been taken. Others, quieter, began to recount small oddities. A missed deposit that was explained away. A week's delay with a sheepish smile. Receipts that never arrived. A gentle suggestion from Trevor that the bank's computers were playing up. What made Trevor's scheme so effective was that he didn't ask for the money. It was offered to him, willingly, repeatedly, and with deep trust. He'd made himself so invisible in people's lives that they stopped questioning him. And once he realized this, he began to push it further. The codes next to the ledger entries: R. Recurring. P. Pensioner. C. Cash only. L. Likely to forget. He wasn't just recording what people gave him, he was profiling them. Traces abroad. Interpol flagged Trevor's passport weeks after his disappearance, used at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, outbound to Casablanca. From there, the trail went cold. But a month later, police received a tip. A man resembling Trevor had been seen in Essaouira, Morocco, staying at a small guest house under the name Thomas Malley. He paid in cash, rode a moped, kept to himself. By the time authorities arrived, the man was gone. He left behind an empty room and a handwritten note tucked inside a Gideon Bible. "What they gave me was trust. What I gave them back was belief. Isn't that fair?" To date, Trevor Mallory has never been found. The unresolved thought. There was no pension fund, no bank slips, no investments, just a handwritten ledger, a van, and a man who knew how to move unseen. His crime wasn't violent. It wasn't even sophisticated. It was quiet, personal, local. And that's what made it so devastating. He didn't rob a bank. He was the bank. And he knew the one thing no lock can guard against. If you're already invited into someone's life, you don't need a key. Long after Trevor Mallory's white van was towed from behind the old shed on Eastmoor Lane, its familiar rattle still echoed in Hawksbridge memory. The milk rounds continued, eventually, with a new man in a new van, but the morning air no longer held the same trust. By June 2013, the official missing persons case had evolved into a full-scale financial fraud investigation. Headlines moved from "Missing Milkman Worries Town" to "Hometown Hero Vanishes with £200,000. The innocence of the story was gone. Still, few could reconcile the idea of Trevor, a man who once fixed porch lights and carried groceries for the elderly, with that of a calculating conman. But the evidence wasn't theoretical. It was financial. It was methodical. And it had left real victims behind. The village that trusted too much. The backbone of Trevor's operation was unregulated proximity trust, a form of informal reliance that flourishes in small, self-contained communities. As authorities dug deeper, it became clear that the scheme didn't rely on deception so much as assumed goodwill. People didn't question Trevor's movements. They rarely asked for receipts. And when they did, he produced believable copies, photocopied deposit slips, bank-branded envelopes, even fabricated confirmation texts using a second mobile phone with a spoofed bank number. He'd say things like, "It'll go through overnight, love. Don't worry, I know the girls at the Halifax. It'll show by Friday." And people believed him. Over time, he even advised people on how to save. Don't put it all in at once, banks notice that. Better to stagger it. Keep it off your kids' radar. Sometimes they're too eager to help manage your money. In this way, Trevor slowly isolated his depositors, not maliciously but surgically. By 2012, several elderly clients had stopped managing their own finances altogether. They trusted Trevor more than their own family. A familiar face, a foreign land. Interpol's only real lead came from Essaouira, a sleepy port town on Morocco's western coast. Known for its whitewashed buildings and seafront cafes, it had become a quiet haven for retirees, artists, and, increasingly, disappeared people. Trevor's suspected alias, Thomas Malley, was traced to a guest house owned by a German expat couple. He paid in cash, spoke rarely, and claimed to be recovering from a divorce. The guest house manager recalled him reading old English newspapers, the Times mostly, and smoking hand-rolled cigarettes at dawn. He stayed for 6 weeks. When shown a photo of Trevor Mallory, the manager confirmed. Yes, that was him, but he had no accent, spoke almost like an actor would, neutral, not North, not London, just calm. By the time authorities reached Essaouira, he was gone. He left no digital footprint, no calls, no bank cards, no emails. Just silence. Cracks in the routine. Back in Hawkesbridge, the damage deepened. Joyce Harmon, 83, had handed over her life savings, pound 27,000 over 5 years. Martin and Hilary Bain, a retired couple, had asked Trevor to deposit £10,000 toward their granddaughter's university fund. Andy Godfrey, a local butcher, used Trevor to make weekly business deposits of £300, 500. Some tried to claim the losses on insurance. Others looked to their banks, but without formal documentation or proof of fraud, there was little recourse. There were no contracts, only envelopes and trust. In total, only £2,500 of the money was ever recovered, from a small account in Trevor's name in Sheffield. Authorities believe it was a decoy account, maintained to offer plausible deniability if questions ever arose. It held just enough to look in use, but not enough to matter. The first suspicion. The first real cracks in Trevor's carefully maintained illusion didn't come from his clients. They came from a new couple, the Mallisons, who had moved to Hawkesbridge in 2012. One afternoon, they asked Trevor for advice on depositing money into an ISA. Trevor politely declined, said he wasn't doing that sort of favor anymore. This was 6 months before he vanished. What the Mallisons noticed, though, was how twitchy Trevor seemed. He left their property quickly, didn't linger like usual. Later, they learned from a neighbor that Trevor hadn't stopped helping others. Only them. The Mallisons had no history with him, no long ties, no emotional loyalty. They might have noticed too much. Investigators now believe Trevor sensed suspicion and began preparing to flee. Building the exit. Police financial analysts pieced together Trevor's final 6 months from scraps. Purchases from international travel websites under alias emails. A PO box rented in Leeds under the name T. Manley. A cash transfer of £2,000 to a third-party account in Spain. CCTV footage of Trevor at a currency exchange in Birmingham. converting GBP to Moroccan dirhams over multiple visits. The pattern was deliberate. He didn't leave in haste. He planned it. And the morning, he drove half his milk round before vanishing. It was likely calculated, designed to delay panic, buy him time, and cover his exit window. The ripple effect. Trevor's disappearance triggered a cascade of changes in Hawksbridge and similar villages nearby. Community groups organized financial literacy workshops for the elderly. Local councils began pushing for mobile banking vans to visit rural areas weekly. The post office created a new safe deposit relay program, allowing designated, registered individuals to handle deposits on behalf of those with mobility issues, with tracking and confirmation protocols built in. In some ways, Trevor's crime served as a catalyst for modernization. But it came at a cost. A community divided. Years later, a mural was painted on the Hawksbridge Community Center wall. It depicted various aspects of village life: the allotments, the cricket pitch, the war memorial, and in one corner, a milk float. Some wanted Trevor removed. Others insisted on keeping it. One elderly resident, Marjorie Ellis, defended the decision in the local paper. "He did wrong, no question, but pretending he didn't exist won't heal us. He's part of our story, whether we like it or not." In an odd way, Trevor Mallory became both villain and folk legend, a rural anti-hero who exposed the fragility of assumed decency. He didn't rob strangers. He robbed friends. And people can't decide what's worse. The unresolved thought: Trevor Mallory may never be found. His clients, now older, may never see their money returned. And the lesson: it's not about banks or signatures or secure transactions. It's about how easily routine becomes ritual. And how ritual, when paired with charm and familiarity, becomes something even more dangerous. A blind spot. 3 years after Trevor Mallory vanished, a child in Hawksbridge found a bottle buried in the hedgerow near the town's war memorial. It was one of Trevor's, a thick glass container with the initials TM etched near the base. Still intact, cap rusted shut. Someone had stuffed a note inside, sealed it with tape. The handwriting was shaky. "If you find this, you should know, he helped me once, but that doesn't mean he didn't rob me too." That quiet duality of man and myth still defined Trevor Mallory. He was a milkman. He was a thief. He was a neighbor. He was gone. The international phantom. Interpol continued to monitor suspected sightings of Mallory for years. Leads trickled in from a beachfront cafe in Cyprus, where a British man paid for breakfast with crisp pound notes and tipped in dirhams. A remote fishing village in Portugal, where a Mr. Thomas had bought an old boat and lived aboard for a year. A Spanish hostel where someone matching Trevor's age and description was seen reading a worn copy of The Observer, dated the week of his disappearance. Each lead brought hope, none brought results. Trevor left no paper trail, no digital footprint, and, perhaps most unsettling, no need to reappear. Authorities now suspect he converted most of the stolen £212,000 into physical assets, cash, possibly gold, and portable valuables. Financial behavior experts believe he had help. This level of planning suggests external advisement, one investigator noted. Either he got lucky with research or someone coached him, someone who had done this before. But no co-conspirator has ever been identified. The cases that followed. Trevor's disappearance ignited a national conversation about trust-based crimes, not high-tech cyber attacks, not organized bank fraud, but localized, personal thefts, ones that hide inside social fabric until it's too late. In the 2 years following his escape, UK police logged a 47% increase in complaints involving informal investment schemes, neighbors handling deposits or cash payments, helpers volunteering to manage pensions, pay bills, or assist with bank errands. One case from Kent involved a church treasurer who redirected £96,000 in tithes over 5 years, spending it on horse racing bets. Another, in Devon, saw a retired fireman run an illegal savings scheme out of his garage, collapsing when he fled to France with £180,000. These cases weren't driven by malice at first. They were driven by ease. And once discovered, nearly all shared the same response. I never thought they'd notice. Victims in silence. The true victims of Trevor's crime weren't just financial. They were emotional. Families that split over blame. Elderly neighbors who stopped trusting the very people who once brought them meals and medicine. A village that redefined neighborliness with suspicion instead of warmth. Several of the original victims passed away before resolution ever came. Joyce Harmon died in 2016. Her niece, who now lives in her cottage, found a journal Joyce had kept after the scandal broke. One entry stood out. "He didn't steal my money. He stole the good parts of my memories. I don't even like my front porch anymore." That's the legacy of a quiet con. Not just loss, but erosion. A slow undoing of comfort. The van that stayed. For years, Trevor's old milk van sat impounded in Sheffield, gathering dust and rust. Legally, it was still registered in his name. No relatives claimed it. In 2019, it was donated to a rural crime awareness exhibit run by the South Yorkshire Police. Visitors now walk past it during tour, accompanied by a small plaque that reads, "The milkman who knew everyone's door code." Children point at the odd shape. Adults shake their heads. Volunteers tell the story not with drama, but with quiet warning. Not every thief wears a mask. Some carry a milk crate. Where is he now? That question haunts Hawksbridge still. An investigative journalist named Priya Ainsley produced a 3-part podcast on the Mallory case titled Crates and Confidence, The Vanishing Milkman. In her final episode, she plays a voicemail she received from an anonymous tipster. The voice is disguised, filtered, and warped, but unmistakably British, possibly Northern. The message: "You're looking in the wrong places. He didn't disappear. He stopped delivering. That's not the same thing." For a moment, it reignited speculation that Trevor may still be in the UK, living under a new name, blending into a different town. Some believe he never left at all. That he lives quietly, perhaps a few towns over, in a flat he bought with cash, among people who never ask questions. Because in the end, Trevor didn't need to escape far. He just needed to escape doubt. Closing the case. In 2021, South Yorkshire Police formally closed the active investigation. Trevor Mallory remains a wanted man, with an active warrant for fraud, misappropriation of funds, and failure to appear in connection with ongoing financial inquiries. The case is technically unsolved, but the crime is not. Its evidence lingers, in the homes of those who trusted, in the routines they now second-guess, in the neighborhoods that no longer wave as easily. The thought that lingers: Trevor didn't use a gun. He didn't hack a server or forge documents. He simply asked, and people gave. Not because they were foolish, but because they were kind, because they believed they were helping each other. And in that belief, they opened a door wide enough for someone to slip through and close it behind him. Quietly, completely, with nothing but a clink of empty bottles. Story 6. The locksmith who broke into empty homes. Every city has a man like Malcolm Brierley. In Manchester, he was the kind of tradesman people recommended without hesitation. A certified locksmith with fair rates, a pleasant manner, and a knack for making anxious customers feel at ease. He wore thick glasses, spoke with a soft Lancashire lilt, and always arrived in a well-kept blue van with the words MB Lock and Safe painted neatly on the side. For 2 decades, Malcolm made his living fixing broken locks, installing new security systems, and, ironically, reassuring families that their homes were secure. What no one realized was that Malcolm kept copies of nearly every key he ever cut. And for 6 years, he used those copies to break into homes. Not to ransack them, not even to steal expensive electronics or jewelry. Instead, Malcolm targeted quiet homes, the kind where the owners were on long holidays, where old folks had recently passed away, where the grass was uncut and the curtains were drawn shut all day. He stole just enough to avoid notice. A single necklace, a stack of tucked-away cash, occasionally an heirloom watch. He called it light lifting. To his clients, he was the man who kept them safe. But by the time police caught on, Malcolm Brierly had burglarized at least 86 homes. And not one lock was broken in the process. A man of precision. Malcolm wasn't flashy. He rarely dined out, never traveled, didn't drink, lived alone in a modest brick semi-detached home in Cheetham Hill. He did, however, keep records. Not official ledgers or digital spreadsheets. His logs were analog, scrapbooks, paper notebooks, and matchbooks with addresses scribbled in shorthand. Each entry was coded. B27C Long Holiday May. Og No Dog 1 Ring Loft Access. WDN 102 Widow Passed, Empty Till Probate, Silver Set in Lounge. HTC 14 Job via Estate Agent. For sale, vacant 3 Mo's. Check Oct. What made Malcolm especially dangerous was that he never forced entry. He didn't use crowbars or break windows. Instead, he waited. Sometimes weeks. Sometimes months. Then, when he knew no one was home, he'd let himself in. The crime no alarm detects. Security systems are designed to detect threats. Motion sensors, window break alerts, cameras triggered by sound. But none of them account for a man with a key. Malcolm understood this perfectly. He wasn't a criminal by impulse. He was an opportunist trained in the vulnerabilities he later exploited. Clients invited him into their homes, trusting him to rekey doors, upgrade locks, or install smart deadbolts. They gave him access to back patios, garages, and even safes. And all the while he took notes, not just of their security layouts, but of their habits. When they left for work, what brand of alarm they used, where they hid the spare key just in case. He didn't rush, he never doubled back, and he never left a mess. Even when he took something, he left drawers neat, jewelry boxes closed, beds made. Which is why, for so long, no one noticed anything missing. The first suspicion. In October 2018, an estate solicitor named Paula Cragg was preparing a probate inventory for the home of a recently deceased client, a retired professor. She'd personally visited the home 3 weeks earlier and had cataloged all major valuables, including a small collection of antique coins in a glass case. When she returned to photograph them for documentation, the coins were gone. But there was no sign of entry. No damage, no alarms, no broken locks. It seemed impossible, until a casual comment from the professor's neighbor changed everything. Shame he never changed the locks after the locksmith came. He always said the man was nice, but a bit nosy. That locksmith, Malcolm Brierly. Paula didn't make the connection immediately, but 6 weeks later, while handling a different estate case, she noticed something eerily familiar. A home supposedly untouched since the owner's death, but small items missing. Loose cash, a decorative knife, a gold lighter. Again, the locksmith used had been MB Lock and Safe. She flagged both cases to Greater Manchester Police. At first, they dismissed it. Too little, no signs of entry, no proof. But Paula persisted. and eventually, Detective Inspector Helen Voss took interest. Building the pattern. D.I. Voss had handled high-profile fraud cases, but something about the subtlety of these burglaries intrigued her. She requested work records for MB lock and safe. Malcolm had been scrupulous with invoices. Every client, every call-out, every payment, even cash, was logged in a tidy black ledger. But D.I. Voss noticed something odd. A significant number of the homes Malcolm serviced had since filed quiet, minor burglary reports, many with no signs of forced entry. She cross-referenced police reports, estate listings, and insurance claims across 6 years. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Malcolm had access to hundreds of homes. Many had since changed ownership or been emptied. Some were abandoned altogether. What D.I. Voss found most chilling was the timing. Malcolm never struck right after a job. He waited. He allowed time to pass, for people to forget. And then he'd slip in. Watching the locksmith. In April 2019, Greater Manchester Police placed Malcolm under passive surveillance. They monitored his van, checked his workshop, ran plate scans. For weeks there was nothing, just routine job, locksmith duties, quiet nights. Then on May 14, at 11:47 p.m., Malcolm parked 2 streets away from a semi-detached home in Withington. The occupants were on holiday in Spain. He exited the van with a tool bag. There were no forced doors, no signs of struggle. He left less than 20 minutes later. Police entered the home the next morning. They found a few drawers disturbed, but nothing broken, nothing obvious. Except for a single antique brooch, missing from a jewelry case. It was enough. D.I. Voss authorized a search warrant. The workshop of copies. When officers raided Malcolm's workshop behind his home, they found 142 labeled key blanks, sorted by address codes. Over 80 matched house keys. An inventory log written in code. 6 notebooks filled with surveillance notes. A shoebox of small valuables, cufflinks, rings, a miniature silver Bible, 5 Rolex watches, and £17,000 in assorted currency. Malcolm was arrested on suspicion of burglary, theft, and breach of professional trust. He didn't resist. In fact, his first words were, "You can't prove which homes they came from." The psychology of light theft. Criminal psychologists who later interviewed Malcolm found him curiously unapologetic, not boastful, not aggressive. Just flat. Neutral. He described his actions as harmless removals. They didn't need the things. Most of them didn't even notice they were gone. To him, it wasn't theft. It was harvesting. A passive crime, a quiet exchange. And most disturbingly, he didn't see the victims as people. He saw them as opportunities. Houses without context, locks without resistance. The unresolved thought. In court, Malcolm was sentenced to 8 years for multiple counts of burglary and abuse of access. But most of the stolen items were never returned, because many victims never knew what had been taken. The judge remarked, "Yours was not a crime of violence but of erasure. You removed things without trace, leaving behind confusion, not destruction." Malcolm served less than 5 years. He was released in 2024. His current whereabouts are unknown. What remains is a question every homeowner must now ask. How many keys to your life have already been copied? And if someone entered quietly, left quietly, and took just enough to not be noticed, would you even know? When Malcolm Brierley was sentenced in 2019, local media dubbed him the gentleman burglar. It was a misleading term. There was nothing charming about what he'd done. He hadn't just taken things. He'd undermined the very concept of home as a sanctuary. And worse, He'd done it under the pretense of providing safety. But even after his arrest, Greater Manchester police were left with an overwhelming question. How deep did the lockbox go? The ring of quiet crimes. As DI Helen Voss and her team combed through Malcolm's notebooks and coded entries, they began to notice something odd. Several addresses listed in his books didn't match his official job logs. He had clearly been monitoring homes he hadn't serviced. Why? Upon deeper examination, it became clear that Malcolm had formed a network, not of accomplices in the traditional sense, but of other tradesmen, painters, real estate agents, heating engineers, people he'd met on the job, sometimes referred to by only a first name or a set of initials in his records. They would mention homes sitting empty, and Malcolm would make a note. C.H. Plummer, Sutton Row, lady gone to hospice, house untouched. Ray at estate firm, probate delays, keys in drawer, no alarm. While there's no evidence these individuals knew what he intended to do with the information, their casual comments gave him a wider field of targets. It wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was something more dangerous. Unintentional complicity. A system built on forgetting. Malcolm's method worked because no one expected him to do what he did. He wore a uniform, drove a marked van, issued receipts, paid taxes, carried official ID. He wasn't lurking in shadows. He was showing up for appointments booked weeks in advance. Even when he returned to burgle a home, he didn't wear a mask or gloves. He simply walked in like he belonged there. Neighbors, if they noticed him at all, assumed he was there for maintenance. After all, how many people question a man with a toolbox? Investigators later learned he had even visited the same property more than once, months apart. Each time he left with small, almost imperceptible items, cash tucked into a drawer, a gold chain left beside a mirror, a pair of silver earrings in a dusty trinket box. These weren't smash-and-grab crimes. They were crimes of familiarity. The limits of justice. In the months following his conviction, victims began to come forward, some angry, some embarrassed, some simply confused. One woman, 77-year-old Ruth Lambert, reported that her husband's Royal Navy service medals were missing. She hadn't noticed for nearly a year, assuming they'd been misplaced after a recent move. Another man discovered his grandfather's pocket watch, long assumed lost, was later sold through an antique dealer, who traced the item back to an estate auction where it had been anonymously consigned. Because Malcolm's thefts were so subtle, the window for proving ownership was often lost. Insurance companies refused to reimburse most claims. Police simply couldn't connect each stolen item to each crime scene with enough certainty. In the end, dozens of stolen pieces remained unclaimed. Digital breadcrumbs. One of the few breakthroughs in the case came from an unlikely source, an old laptop found in Malcolm's loft. It hadn't been used regularly. Most of his operations were analog, but police digital forensics found a set of encrypted folders that Malcolm had clumsily hidden using outdated software. Inside were spreadsheets with coded client names, backup scans of his notebooks, a detailed document labeled "Visited, not yet touched." It listed 24 addresses, with corresponding notes about when the homeowners were expected to be away next. One address had an annotation that simply read, "Family goes to Spain each August, alarm faulty, garden gate key in birdhouse." It was chilling in its specificity. The spreadsheet was dated June 2019, just a month before his arrest. Police issued warnings to each of the listed homes. 3 residents had already reported minor thefts in recent months. The ethics of access. In the wake of the case, the British Locksmiths Institute revised its certification protocols. Locksmiths were now required to submit quarterly access logs to a secure registry. Clients had to sign acknowledgement forms confirming receipt of keys and whether or not copies were retained. Key retention policies were rewritten industry-wide, banning locksmiths from holding spares without explicit written consent. But these changes couldn't undo the erosion of trust Malcolm had caused. A profession built on protection had been used to facilitate violation. And it begged a broader question. What happens when the gatekeeper is the one who opens the door? The copycat risk. Malcolm's arrest and the media attention that followed sparked fears of similar abuses elsewhere. Indeed, a year after his sentencing, two separate cases surfaced. In Gloucestershire, a property manager was found to have stolen tenant valuables while inspecting empty flats during off hours. In Surrey, a security installer copied alarm codes and accessed 5 homes, disabling cameras before removing cash. Both were arrested, but the template had already been proven. If someone is invited in and given trust and access and a schedule, why would they ever need to break in at all? Malcolm's final statement. At his sentencing hearing, Malcolm gave a brief statement. He didn't read from a paper. He didn't cry. He said, "Most people forget what they own. They move house and never check a drawer again. I just took things that weren't being used. That's not theft. That's awareness." It was the closest he ever came to expressing remorse. But it wasn't remorse. It was justification. The lingering silence. After Malcolm's release in 2024, he disappeared from public view. No interviews, no further charges. His license was permanently revoked, and he was barred from operating any business related to home security. But some believe he never stopped, that he simply moved towns, that he started over quietly under a new name. Because really, how hard is it for a skilled locksmith to pick a new lock? The unresolved thought. We spend so much time locking our doors, checking our alarms, setting up smart cameras and motion lights. But few of us ask, who holds the keys we never asked to be made? And if someone entered your home, not with force but with access, would you even realize? Or would the only evidence be a missing trinket? A misplaced heirloom? A quiet sense that something is off? It's one thing to catch a criminal. It's another to measure the crime. By the time Greater Manchester Police had finished cataloging the evidence tied to Malcolm Brierly's quiet spree, they faced a conundrum. How do you quantify theft when the victims never knew they were victims? What Malcolm stole wasn't just silverware or war medals, it was certainty, the illusion of control, the trust in one's own memory. Because his crimes weren't about what he took. They were about what he left behind. The cold inventory. After the trial, officers created a database to log all items recovered from Malcolm's workshop and home. The file was bleak. 121 rings, 38 wristwatches, 19 decorative boxes, 15 antique coins, 4 sets of foreign currency bundles, several personal photographs and keepsakes. But the challenge wasn't just proving the items were stolen, it was proving from whom. In most cases, Malcolm never kept detailed sourcing. His ledgers used vague location markers or client codes that only he could interpret. Some items were returned. A widow in Prestwich identified a wedding band with her late husband's initials inside. A family in Eccles retrieved a set of World War II medals after noticing their father's regimental number engraved on the back. One woman, visiting the police exhibit with her son, spotted a gold chain she thought she'd lost over a decade prior, confirmed via an insurance photo from years ago. But many items remained orphaned. The Metropolitan Museum of London's Forensic Anthropology Division assisted in cataloging the remaining pieces. They published an anonymous online gallery titled Unclaimed: The Quiet Burglary Archive. It's still live today. Echoes in other towns. Though Malcolm's crimes were confined to Greater Manchester, similar incidents began surfacing in other UK regions shortly after his case went public. In Newcastle, a retired locksmith was arrested after a tenant discovered duplicate keys hidden behind insulation panels. In Essex, a security contractor admitted to taking tips in the form of trinkets from homes he worked in, over 60 properties. In Wales, a former estate agent was caught using retained house keys to browse empty homes at night. He claimed he liked imagining lives that used to be there. None of these cases matched Malcolm's scale or sophistication. But the theme was consistent. Access granted, trust exploited, entry without suspicion. Malcolm's arrest had opened the floodgates. Inside the mind of a quiet thief. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elinor Braddock interviewed Malcolm extensively in the year following his conviction. Her notes became part of a classified police training seminar on professional access offenders. She described Malcolm as distant but not cold, disconnected from consequence. He didn't fit typical criminal profiles. No trauma history. No financial desperation. No known mental illness. No signs of thrill-seeking or compulsive behavior. Instead, he described his actions as tidying the world. So much stuff just sits, waiting to be forgotten, Malcolm told her. I never took things in anger. I only chose what didn't seem loved anymore. When asked if he felt guilt, he replied, only for getting caught, not for noticing what others ignored. The Ghost Protocol. One element of Malcolm's strategy continued to fascinate law enforcement. He never entered a property more than twice. He claimed that anything beyond a second visit was bad manners. More importantly, he always wore the same clothes he'd worn during official jobs, to appear familiar if caught on CCTV or by neighbors. On at least 2 occasions, he was even greeted by passers-by while exiting homes he'd quietly burgled. Neither reported anything suspicious. He left no fingerprints, no DNA. And when taking valuables, he only selected things unlikely to be noticed for months. The bottom ring in a stack. A drawer with loose foreign coins. A single bottle from a wine collection. A photograph from the back of a family album. He was, in essence, a ghost with a keyring. The case that never closed. Malcolm served 4 years of his 8-year sentence and was released in early 2024. He refused interviews. He declined relocation support. And then he vanished. Rumors surfaced that he'd moved to Scotland under a different name, that he was living in a mobile home, traveling across the countryside, that he had left the country entirely. No one knows for certain. But months after his release, 2 suspicious break-ins were reported in neighboring towns. Items missing, no forced entry, no fingerprints, no alarm triggers. Police didn't name him, but internally, investigators referred to the file as Echoes of MB. The long-term impact. Malcolm's crimes had lasting ripple effects in Greater Manchester and beyond. Locksmith licensing reform. The British Locksmiths Institute now mandates fingerprint background checks and full digital key audit trails for certified locksmiths. Client awareness campaigns. Posters and mailers were distributed to homeowners warning them to ask how many copies of their keys exist, who holds spares, when were their locks last changed. Surveillance integration. Alarm companies updated packages to include authorized re-entry notifications, alerts sent to homeowners if someone with previously logged access entered the home again at a later date. Estate vulnerability tracking. Probate lawyers in the UK now routinely request locksmith history as part of standard security assessments for vacant estates. Malcolm's thefts rewrote how the legal system understands non-forcible burglary. A final message. Shortly after his release, a single letter, handwritten, unsigned, was mailed to D.I. Helen Voss. It read, "Most locks don't need picking. They need forgetting. Everyone forgets eventually." It bore no fingerprints, no return address, no proof it came from Malcolm. But Voss believed it did. She filed it under evidence, then locked it in a drawer. The unresolved thought. We obsess over broken windows and crowbars. We fear masked strangers and late-night invaders. But most homes are breached not by force, but by permission long forgotten. So the question is whether your locks are strong. It's this: who once held a key, and why haven't you changed it since? Story 7. The funeral director who claimed the living were dead. In the small Yorkshire town of Dewsbury, nestled between aging hills and quiet Victorian terraces, there was one man everyone trusted when the worst happened. Norman Latchford was the town's most respected funeral director. His chapel, Latchford and Sons, had served grieving families for 3 generations. With its ivy-covered stonework and heavy oak doors, it looked more like a country church than a business. And Norman, always in his crisp black suit and gray tie, exuded dignity. He knew how to speak softly. He knew when to step away. He never forgot a name. What no one knew was that Norman had declared over a dozen living people legally dead and profited from every one of their burials. His crime didn't involve bodies. It involved paperwork. A slow, methodical fraud built on death certificates, insurance loopholes, and the eerie assumption that some people simply disappear. The master of mourning. To the townsfolk of Dewsbury and its surrounding villages, Norman Latchford was not just a mortician, he was a steward of sorrow. He handled the worst days of people's lives with grace. When a loved one died, he took care of the arrangements. The phone calls, the floral displays, the paperwork, the transport. He never chased payments. He never upcharged grieving families. He even offered discreet services for those who couldn't afford proper funerals. Latchford's compassion was not an act. In fact, it was precisely because of his stellar reputation that his scam worked so well. For nearly 5 years, Norman filed legal paperwork for funerals that never happened, for people who weren't dead, and for graves that were never dug. And no one questioned a thing. The paper trail begins. The fraud began modestly. In 2016, after Norman handled a body for an elderly man who had passed away without any known relatives. The man, a reclusive drifter named Kenneth Hargrove, lived on the outskirts of town in a condemned cottage. His remains were found by utility workers after neighbors noticed the post piling up. With no family to claim the body, the coroner turned the case over to Norman, who handled the cremation pro bono. But when Norman searched Hargrove's records, he discovered something strange. Kenneth had once held a life insurance policy, canceled years prior, but never updated in government records. The policy was considered dormant, forgotten. Norman made a call, then another. By the time he filed the final paperwork, he'd managed to collect a £12,000 payout, citing himself as the executor of the unclaimed estate. There was no pushback, no red tape. And with that single transaction, Norman discovered how to bury someone who never truly died. The perfect victims. Over the next 48 months, Norman carefully expanded the scam. He wasn't reckless. He didn't forge death certificates for people still living in town. He didn't target the young. He never messed with official coroners or active physicians. Instead, he studied records, deeds, hospital discharges, mental health facility rosters, and old council housing archives. He looked for people who had no next of kin, who had been institutionalized, who were long-term transients, who had vanished from the system. He found them by sifting through hospital closures, old pension ledgers, and social service black holes. People who had fallen between the cracks. Then he did what he always did best. He filed the paperwork. He registered them as deceased with the local council. He submitted basic documentation, sometimes forged, sometimes not, to insurers or small state life benefit programs. And he created the illusion that they had passed peacefully. One case read, Patricia Lee, 73, died in sleep, no known family, quiet cremation. There was no Patricia Lee in Dewsbury. There was one in Nottingham, last seen in a psychiatric facility 8 years earlier. And Norman knew she'd likely never be found. The funerals. Norman didn't fake large public services. That would have been dangerous. Instead, he claimed he was offering paupers' cremations, low-cost funerals for the unclaimed and destitute, a government-funded service in the UK for those without family or means. He submitted invoices to local councils and sometimes directly to private care homes, suggesting that he'd taken responsibility for anonymous patients. Each invoice was modest, £900 here, £1,200 there. But over time it added up. And in many cases, Norman went a step further. He would even place small funeral notices in obscure regional newspapers, with phrases like, "In loving memory of DL passed peacefully, cremation held privately." It gave the illusion of legitimacy. No one asked questions. After all, who would doubt the man who had buried everyone's grandmother? Cracks in the crypt. The first anomaly was caught in Leeds, 25 miles away, by a low-level administrative clerk reviewing a cross-council database of deceased residents. She noticed something peculiar. 2 individuals, both listed as deceased in Dewsbury, were also listed as receiving benefits from Leeds Council. At first, she thought it was a clerical error. But when she searched further, she discovered one of them, Janet Hollier, had been treated at a Leeds rehabilitation center just 3 months after her supposed date of death. She raised a quiet internal inquiry. It was dismissed as a paperwork mix-up. But she didn't forget. The investigation grows. In early 2021, the clerk, a woman named Rachel Dines, flagged the issue again, this time to a regional auditor conducting a routine insurance fraud compliance review. He cross-referenced Norman Latchford's name and found that his business had received government reimbursements for 14 unclaimed cremations in the past 3 years. Of those, 6 had been double-registered elsewhere. It wasn't enough to launch a criminal inquiry, yet. But it was suspicious enough that the auditor passed the information to the Department for Work and Pensions, DWP, fraud unit. They began a quiet audit of Norman's filings. Within 2 months, they uncovered duplicate identities, forged physician signatures, and most tellingly, a series of identical funeral invoices submitted under different deceased names. The addresses listed for the cremations. All the same plot number, the same cremation date, the same service fee. Something was deeply wrong. Watching the man who buried ghosts, the DWP fraud unit, with local police assistance, began covert surveillance of Latchford and Sons in late 2021. They examined burial records. They quietly interviewed gravediggers. They checked crematorium logs. And what they found was chilling. Several of the individuals Norman had claimed to have cremated never existed. Others had been declared dead despite being alive, though unreachable or off-grid. One woman was found living in a caravan in Scarborough. Another had checked herself into a private psychiatric facility under a variation of her maiden name. When police finally raided Latchford's office, they found pre-filled cremation paperwork with no corresponding body, fake signatures from doctors who had been retired for years, empty urns labeled with names of people who were still alive, a ledger listing quiet burials, no family, with monetary figures beside each name. Norman didn't resist arrest. When asked why he did it, he said quietly, "I just thought someone should say goodbye." The unresolved thought. Norman Latchford was charged with 18 counts of fraud, forgery, and misuse of government funds. At trial, some locals defended him. They called it a victimless crime. After all, no one had died, at least not in the way you'd expect. But the judge disagreed. She called it a violation of dignity, of memory, and of our collective trust in death's finality. Latchford was sentenced to 12 years. He died in prison, ironically, with no one to claim his body. And his funeral, handled by the council. No flowers, no notice, just a number on a form. Which leaves us with a final, unsettling question. How many of the dead never actually died? And how many were buried not in soil, but in forgotten paperwork? After Norman Latchford's arrest, investigators didn't just focus on the crimes he had already committed. They began asking a broader, more unsettling question. How many people across the country were legally dead, but still breathing? Norman's case was not only about fraud, it revealed something deeper. It exposed the quiet collapse of systems meant to track the living and honor the dead. And it turned out Norman hadn't just gamed the system. He had exploited its blind spots. Death by bureaucracy. In the UK, when someone dies, the process of officially recording that death follows a defined path. A doctor signs a medical certificate of cause of death, MCCD. The certificate is registered with the local registrar. A death certificate is issued, triggering a cascade of updates. HM Passport Office, NHS, Department for Work and Pensions, Council tax offices, banks and insurance companies. But all of these depend on accurate initial registration. If a rogue actor can forge an MCCD and slip it past a registrar, particularly in small towns with aging systems, it can activate the full chain of consequence. That's exactly what Norman did. He understood that many registrars don't cross-check identities in real time. Some used paper logs. Some trusted long-term funeral directors implicitly. In fact, Norman had built relationships with key administrators over decades. He knew which ones asked questions and which didn't. The disappearing poor. Norman didn't invent fake people. He didn't need to. There are thousands of people in the UK who go unaccounted for each year. Seniors with no family. Homeless individuals who drift between towns. Psychiatric patients discharged with no fixed address. Immigrants with incomplete documentation. Residents of care homes who are quietly moved between facilities. In many ways, Norman simply chose people the system had already forgotten. He would track them through archived care home rosters, old electoral rolls, hospital discharge records, even parish donation lists from years past. His talent wasn't fabrication. It was curation. He selected the kind of people no one would look for. And the longer they were missing, the more believable their deaths became. Following the money. Most of Norman's fraud revolved around modest financial returns. Government reimbursements for unclaimed cremations. Dormant life insurance policies, especially small-value ones that didn't require aggressive verification. Burial assistance, grants from councils for low-income individuals. Unclaimed estates managed through the bona vacantia division of the UK Treasury. Each payout ranged from £1,000 to £12,000. Individually, not staggering. But over 5 years, authorities estimated he stole nearly £320,000 through this method. The funds were funneled into business expansions. He opened a second funeral van service briefly. Property, he purchased a small rental flat in Halifax. An overseas investment fund linked to a relative in Spain. But much of the money simply sat, untouched in savings. Norman wasn't driven by desperation. He was driven by opportunity. The digital witness. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation came from Norman's office desktop computer. Buried in a folder labeled simply inactive, officers found dozens of spreadsheet entries, names, dates of birth, rough health histories, estimated date of disappearance, and a column marked suitable, with responses like, yes, no family, no address. Maybe, mental health facility. No, niece in Derby. This wasn't random. It was a death prospecting log. One name caught particular attention. Reginald Hale, age 84, listed as last seen 2013, St. James Hospital, Leeds. A welfare check was ordered. Remarkably, Reginald was found alive, in a small private care home outside of Harrogate. He had no visitors, no phone, and no clue that he had been declared legally dead 2 years prior. His care home had received no notification. His pension had stopped, and no one, not even Reginald, had noticed. The bureaucratic maze. Once someone is declared deceased in official systems, revering that status is profoundly difficult. In Reginald Hale's case, his bank accounts were frozen. His NHS file was archived. His pension payments ceased. His name was removed from the electoral register. Restoring his legal identity required a live medical examination, fingerprinting, legal affidavits from surviving care workers, and eventually a court ruling stating that his previous death was administratively nullified. Even then, his estate had already been processed as unclaimed by the Treasury. It would take nearly a year to reverse. Reginald, confused and somewhat amused, reportedly told a journalist, "Well, I always said I was dying to get out of that old place." But not everyone was so lucky. 2 other individuals on Norman's suitable list had also been declared dead. One was still alive. One had since actually passed away, unaware of the fraud. Their names were later redacted from all public reports. Systems under siege. The Latchford case triggered a nationwide review of local registrar procedures. Among the findings, several rural councils had no digital safeguards against duplicate or suspicious death filings. At least 12 funeral homes across the UK had filed for paupers cremation, reimbursements in excess of national averages. Insurance fraud loopholes allowed payouts below £15,000 with minimal verification in cases of no surviving kin. In response, the government enacted a series of reforms. National Crosscheck Registry. All death certificates must now be verified through a centralized, real-time database to prevent duplicate or false entries. Funeral licensing protocols. Funeral directors must register each cremation with GPS-tagged crematorium logs and cross-reference physician IDs. Estate monitoring. The bona vacantia division now requires formal death confirmation via third-party investigators for unclaimed estates above £5,000. But critics argued these were reactive, not proactive. One journalist described the reforms as locking the cemetery gates after the ghosts have already left. The families who were Because most of Norman's victims were estranged from family, few public complaints ever surfaced. But in 2022, one woman came forward. Her name was Marie Liddell, and she discovered her estranged sister, Elaine, whom she hadn't seen in 11 years, had been declared dead in 2020. Elaine had struggled with mental illness, occasionally checked into care centers, and had no online presence. Marie had recently begun looking for her. But when she contacted local councils, she was told Elaine was deceased. It was only after reading about the Latchford case that she questioned it. A private investigator found Elaine 6 months later, living under a nickname in a community housing project in Birmingham. Elaine was very much alive. When reunited, Marie told reporters, "He stole years we could have had. Not money, not rings, but time, and I'll never get that back." The unresolved thought. In modern society, we think of death as final, legal, clean. But what happens when a form says you're gone? What if someone buries you in paper, quietly, efficiently, without anyone ever seeing a casket? What if your life ends not with a breath, but with a forged signature and an invoice? Norman didn't wield a shovel. He wielded a pen. And sometimes that's all it takes. Norman Latchford was sentenced in December of 2022. His courtroom demeanor remained the same throughout, quiet, polite, immaculately dressed. He made no attempt to deny the charges. Instead, when given a chance to speak during sentencing, he offered only this: "I didn't kill anyone. I just helped finish what had already been forgotten." That single sentence would later appear in dozens of articles, a line that felt both confessional and defiant. But it wasn't just what Norman said that unsettled investigators. It was what he never explained. Because even after months of investigation, interviews, and digital forensics, no one ever figured out how many people he buried on paper. The known total. At the time of his conviction, Norman was formally charged with 18 counts of fraudulent death registration, 12 counts of forged documentation, 7 counts of obtaining property by deception, 1 count of obstruction of a public registry. The confirmed fraud total, £319,450 across 5 years. But the internal police estimate, leaked to journalists months later, placed the number of suspicious death filings at nearly 42. Some could not be traced. Others involved individuals who had since passed away for real, complicating the ability to prosecute. A handful, disturbingly, were still unaccounted for. People declared dead, with no body ever found and no public record of current residence. The one that stayed with them. Detective Inspector Stephen Mallory led the final phase of the investigation. He rarely spoke publicly, but during a lecture at a financial crime symposium, he shared a detail he said still woke him up at night. During the raid on Latchford's office, among the spreadsheets and client logs, police discovered a folder labeled "To Process Pending 2023." Inside were 3 completed death registration forms, ready to submit in the new year. They included full names, date of birth, medical cause of death, mostly listed as cardiac arrest or natural causes, placeholder cremation dates, signed declarations by Norman, invoices prepared to claim from the council. But here's the detail that bothered Mallory most. One of the forms was for a man we found in a care home 2 towns over, still alive, still eating toast and watching cricket. When we told him someone had tried to register his death, he just blinked and said, "Again." It was the second time in 5 years the man had been declared dead. The first time, under a different name, had been buried in red tape and dismissed as an error. They now believed Norman had tried twice. The lonely business of death. After Norman's imprisonment, Latchford and Sons was quietly shuttered. Its assets were seized. The building stood empty for nearly a year. Eventually, it was purchased by a regional funeral chain. The old sign was removed. The ivy was cut back. The new company installed CCTV, updated software, and instituted a four-signature system for every death processed. But the locals never quite trusted the place again. One former employee, speaking anonymously, said, "We thought we were helping people. I handled flowers. I arranged music. But knowing now that it was wrapped around this other thing, I can't walk past it without feeling cold." The scandal had changed something deeper than protocol. It had tainted the idea of what death administration meant. Legal aftershocks. In the wake of the Latchford case, Parliament quietly fast-tracked a new provision to the Births and Deaths Registration Act, mandating dual confirmation. All deaths must be certified by two independent sources, a registered medical practitioner and a local authority liaison. Digital verification system. A centralized portal would flag duplicate filings, dormant benefit accounts, or unusual patterns of death registrations submitted by a single individual or organization. Unclaimed person registry. An inter-council registry was created to help prevent overlapping or conflicting entries for vulnerable individuals, especially those without next of kin. A civil inquiry also raised concerns about how public institutions, care homes, councils, and hospitals handled records for the elderly, mentally ill, or socially isolated. The verdict: we don't really know who's missing. Latchford had simply proven it. His final days. Norman served less than 2 years of his sentence. In early 2024, he was found unresponsive in his cell. The official cause: heart failure. His body went unclaimed. Under standard procedure, the council arranged for a quiet cremation. No family, no service. Ironically, it was the very kind of funeral he used to invent. The attending clerk noted, "He left no instructions. He left no letters, just a name on a form, and maybe that's all he ever wanted." To this day, there are conspiracy theories that Norman faked his own death, one final, perfect trick, but there is no evidence to support it. His fingerprints, dental records, and hospital charts confirmed identity. His ashes were stored for 60 days before being scattered in a municipal garden. He didn't ask for a headstone. He never had one. The ones left in limbo. Despite public pressure, the government never released the full list of names involved in Norman's fraudulent filings. Privacy laws, they said. But one partial document surfaced via a whistleblower, redacted, but revealing just enough. It showed patterns. Care facilities repeatedly targeted. Specific insurance providers named. Elderly patients transferred multiple times in short spans. A preference for facilities with poor oversight or discontinued operations. Among them was a haunting entry. L. Thornton 78, no known visitors, care home shut 2018, suitable. No one ever found L. Thornton. No living relative came forward. His existence, if it was real, remains unverified. And so, in a twisted way, Norman succeeded. He buried someone who had already disappeared. Reflection from the archives. One reporter, Marla Keegan of The Guardian, spent a year covering the Latchford case. In her final article, she wrote, "We always assume death is a fact, but it's really a belief built on paper and trust. Norman Latchford didn't kill people. He erased them, administratively, quietly. And in doing so, he taught us how thin the line is between being remembered and being lost." Her article won awards. But more importantly, it led to renewed interest in digital memorialization, creating permanent public ledgers for deaths, transparent and verified, outside of government bureaucracy.